could believe, looking at life in France in 1914, that the country, along with the whole of Europe, was about to be struck by one of the most terrible tragedies in history. It is true that Alsace-Lorraine was still an unhealed wound, and that there was bitter hatred of the Germans, still known by the insulting name of Les Boches. But nobody really thought that war was possible. There had been peace for nearly 45 years. It was the time of the Franco-Russian alliance, and the Entente Cordiale had replaced the old rivalry with Britain. But the danger was there. Europe's peace was an armed one. The Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a place in the sun. The Parisian crowd filled the Avenue du Bois. Paris danced in the beautiful summer of 1914. And then a spark set everything aflame.
In 1914, Europe embarked on a catastrophic war that would eventually engulf combatants from all 5 continents. It was a global war, fought on land, sea and air, claiming 4 empires and over 10 million lives. Many more lives were blighted by the effects of war. It left Europe, once the cultural center of the world, so deeply divided by political rancor and racial hatred that a Second World War was inevitable. The tragedy is that the First World War need not have happened at all, but for a little more prudence and common goodwill. There were many things that united Europe in the hot summer of 1914. Much of the continent's culture and society were shared institutions. Her royal houses were linked by blood or marriage. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II was the nephew of Britain's Edward VII and a cousin of Tsar Nicholas of Russia. At Edward VII's funeral, no less than 7 crowned heads of state followed his coffin. The royal heads also held honorary positions in each other's armed forces. For example, here is the newly crowned George V and Tsar Nicholas dressed in German uniforms. But there are also many simmering tensions. The rapid rise of a united Germany in the world order of the industrial nations was a particular source of tension. France was particularly implacable. She still harbored a deep resentment following her humiliating defeat by Prussia in 1871 and the loss of territories in Alsace and Lorraine. France's great ally, Russia, was also increasingly alarmed by Germany's rise, as it threatened her dominance in Central and Eastern Europe. Britain, on the other hand, remained rather aloof from the problems of her European neighbours, basking in the security and prestige that came with her empire and Commonwealth. But Britain was alarmed by growing German militarism. Germany wanted a place on the top table of nations and was prepared to use force of arms to establish its credentials. Although most of Germany is landlocked, the Kaiser was deeply envious of Britain's Royal Navy. He was determined to have a fleet to rival the Royal Navies. In Admiral von Tirpitz, he had an enthusiastic supporter who set about turning the Kaiser's dream into a reality, much to Britain's consternation. In 1905, HMS Dreadnought had been built and launched in 4 months. This new class of battleship represented an enormous step forward, giving the Royal Navy a significant advantage, even though she cost over £3 million to build. Her launch led to an arms race as the world's navies realized the Dreadnought represented the future of sea power. Britain was as determined to maintain her naval superiority as the Germans were to try to match it. A new class of super dreadnoughts appeared in 1913. The Queen Elizabeth had 15-inch guns, the biggest in the world, which could deliver a single 15,000-pound broadside. She was also relatively fast, as she was the first battleship to use oil-fired boilers. Her presence also increased the tempo of the arms race, as now every other navy wanted one of these super dreadnoughts, but time was running out. The tensions in Europe were also sharpened by the knowledge that potential or imagined enemies had prepared detailed war plans. These intricate plans left little to chance and included rigid timetables of troop movements and carefully prepared lists of objectives. Central to planning the troop movements were Europe's roads and rail networks. In the Franco-Prussian War, the Prussians had mobilized quickly and effectively, using the rail networks to swiftly transport forces to where they were needed, while French trains remained idle, trapped in a gridlock in their own terminals. Arguably, the most controversial plan was Germany's Schlieffen Plan. The plan was prepared by Alfred von Schlieffen, who was chief of the German Great General Staff from 1891. The plan, published in 1905, was conceived against a background notion of encirclement, with France to the west and Russia in the east. The plan timetabled in minute detail the mobilization of 1 million men who would defeat France in 42 days before heading east to defeat the Russians. It was assumed that Russia would take this long to mobilize due to the sheer vastness of the country. Central to the plan's successful outcome was a swinging attack to come in from the west of Paris, while the main forces flooded across the Belgian and Luxembourg borders to the northeast of the French capital. But the plan, for all its detail, was flawed on 2 counts. First, the quickest and easiest route to Paris was from the north, which meant passing through neutral Belgium, where fortifications were relatively light. Secondly, Schlieffen assumed that British involvement would be minimal, restricted to protecting the Channel ports at best. Belgian neutrality was supposed to be guaranteed by the international treaty signed in 1839 by Britain and Germany, among others. In the years leading up to the war, Schlieffen's successors tinkered with the program. But when it came to war in August 1914, the Germans failed to stick to their master plan. Fatally, they failed to heed Schlieffen's dying words, "Keep the right wing strong." The result was that despite initial success, they could not capitalize on their gains, and thus the Germans were obliged to adopt a defensive posture until the spring of 1918. Knowledge of the Schlieffen plan's existence and some of its contents was alarming for the French and only fueled their paranoia. A series of war plans were devised, culminating in the Plan 17, finalized in the summer of 1914. France's principal objective was the recapture of Alsace and Lorraine. French planners believed that the offensive spirit alone could win the day. Thus, by mounting an unyielding attack in the Alsace, they hoped to overwhelm the Germans, forcing them to pull in reserves from their other fronts. What Plan 17 failed to recognize was that French forces were to be massed away from the brunt of where the German attack was to come. It could not have been worse for the French, or better for the Germans. France and Germany, like all the major belligerents, had large standing armies as a result of conscription. The presence of so many armies, coupled with the self-propelling war plans, only added to the atmosphere of instability. Once the order for mobilization was given, over 3 million men would be on the move in these two countries alone. It was a common belief among military and political leaders, and even the general public, that the timetables that moved the trains, that moved the armies, represented a machine that once set in motion could not be stopped. Thus the order to mobilize became synonymous with a declaration of war, not a precursor to it. Britain, on the other hand, did not have conscription and so relied on a regular army of 150,000 men. On the outbreak of war, this expeditionary force was to be transported to the French border with Belgium, a process that would take some 21 days after mobilization. With so much instability in the region, it was only a matter of time before something sparked a Europe-wide war. At the time, it was generally assumed that a war would only last a few weeks or possibly months. Nobody envisaged the 4 years of slaughter that lay ahead. The spark that ignited the First World War was fired on Sunday, June 28, 1914. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, were on a visit to Sarajevo, the Serbian capital. Gavril Princip, a member of a Serbian nationalist group, was presented with an unexpected opportunity to draw attention to their cause. As the driver turned the imperial couple's car around after taking a wrong turn, Princip drew his pistol and fired twice, killing Franz Ferdinand and his wife. Had Austria taken immediate action, the rest of Europe would probably have sympathized. Instead, there was prevarication in Vienna until 4 weeks later an impossible ultimatum was issued that even the German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, thought was too harsh. In response, Russia began to mobilize her forces in support of her Serbian ally. Germany, who had reassured her Austrian ally that their support was unwavering, also began to mobilize. For good measure, she demanded that France stay neutral and, as an act of good faith, hand over forts on their mutual frontier. France, of course, could not accept. and also declared full mobilization late in the afternoon of July the 31st. On Monday, August the 3rd, Germany declared war on France. At the same time, the Belgians refused a German demand for passage through their country. In Britain, it was the August bank holiday, and many people had set off on their holidays, unaware of the disaster that was beginning to unfold. On Tuesday the 4th, the German army crossed into Belgium as the Schlieffen Plan was put into motion. Britain demanded an immediate withdrawal, but was ignored. In fact, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg dismissed Britain's treaty with Belgium as just a scrap of paper. At midnight, Britain declared war on Germany. France had mobilized over 1.7 million men, organized in 5 armies, and transported them to its northeast frontier. Germany had transported 1.5 million men, organized into 7 armies, to the French and Belgian borders. A further 200,000 were sent to East Prussia to defend against a Russian attack. The Russians, unwilling to wait for their vast armies to mobilize, began to advance into East Prussia with 2 armies, each with 300,000 men. The British were behind schedule, but because our army was much smaller, it did not take as long. The British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, that sailed to France consisted of 2 army corps and a cavalry division, in total 150,000 men. The BEF was to take out positions along the Mons-Condé Canal, just inside Belgium. There followed a brief interlude of 5 to 10 days while supplies were brought up and troops detrained and marched on foot to their start positions. The Germans' advance was already behind schedule due to the spirited defense put up by a tiny Belgian army, 200,000 men. The Germans had had to bring up enormous howitzers to pound the Belgian forts at some considerable cost in lives. The consequences of having to alter the timetable, especially on the all-important right wing, would have serious ramifications in the weeks that followed. The major campaign of the war began with the Battle of the Frontiers. Five offensives were launched by the French under the command of Joseph Joffre. The 10 days during which the battles were fought were to prove costly. Over 300,000 French soldiers were killed. The battles at Mulhouse, Lorraine, the Ardennes, Charleroi and Mons were launched more or less simultaneously and marked the collision of both French Plan 17 and the German Schlieffen Plan. With colours unfurled and bands playing, the French launched their initial attacks, their infantry advancing with bayonets fixed. The opening attack at Mulhouse was successful, as were the opening attacks in Lorraine. But the Germans were simply withdrawing in order to lure the French infantry into traps. They could be blasted by machine guns and heavy artillery. In mounting their counterattack, the Germans succeeded in driving the French back to their start positions. But French reconnaissance aircraft spotted the German build-up and so prepared an adequate defense. When the Germans attacked on August the 24th, they were unable to make significant gains. Despite repeated attempts, the French line held, leading to stalemate and trench warfare. At the same time as the Germans mounted their counter-offensive in Lorraine, they also mounted a major attack in the Ardennes, the densely wooded terrain that straddles the Franco-Belgian border. The French had anticipated meeting such a large German force when it began its attack on August the 21st. But French offensive spirit was no match against well-placed machine guns and artillery. And within 2 days, the French armies were in full flight, only halting the Germans at Sedan and Verdun. Meanwhile, at Charleroi, the Germans inflicted their first outright defeat on the French Fifth Army, commanded by General Lamrezac. Lamrezac had foreseen the German build-up in Belgium, but he was prevented from extending his army north by Joffre, his commander-in-chief. By the time Joffre relented on August the 20th, the German Second Army was nearing Namur. Although Lamrezac wanted to hold off attacking until the British Expeditionary Force was in position, the Germans had already secured 2 bridgeheads across the River Somme. 2 days of heavy fighting followed, with the French taking heavy casualties. But to the west, the line collapsed, exposing the right wing of the British Expeditionary Force at Mons. With news of the French retreat from the Ardennes, Lamrezac was forced to order a general withdrawal of his forces. In so doing, he probably saved the French army from complete destruction. But Joffre chose to make him a scapegoat for French failures and for the failure of Plan 17. At Mons, the British and German forces fought their first battle beginning on August the 23rd. The Germans had not expected to come across the BEF under the command of Sir John French as it sought to link up with General Lamrezac's Fifth Army in Charleroi. Sir John French had 2 infantry corps deployed across a 40-kilometre front east and west of Mons, with the canal in front of them. Their eastern flank almost reached the retreating French Fifth Army. But Sir John French had not anticipated meeting the German First Army as it pursued the retreating French, and certainly not in strength. The Germans outnumbered the British 2-to-1 in infantry and guns, but their opening attacks proved disastrous. The British infantryman was equipped with a magazine-loaded Lee Enfield rifle, and he was trained to fire 15 rounds per minute, accurately. As a result, the Germans were cut down in droves. Indeed, many reported the British seemed to have a great many machine guns. Such was the rapidity and accuracy of their fire. But British losses were also high, some 1,600. Realizing that the BEF was not going to be relieved by Lamrezac, French ordered a retreat. The Germans chose not to give chase, as they had taken many casualties. But the Great Retreat had begun. It would take the British and French armies to the very outskirts of Paris. On August the 26th, 2 corps under General Smith-Dorrien were forced to turn and engage the enemy at Le Cateau. Exhausted by their days of constant marching and fighting, and likely to come under heavy attack anyway, Smith-Dorrien decided they would have a better chance of making a fighting stand. Again, the quaintly named musketry skills of the British infantrymen came to the fore. The German advance was slowed sufficiently to enable the British to organize another retreat. But the cost had been high. Nearly 8,000 British soldiers had become casualties. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain, for the Germans' advance on Paris had been delayed. East of the city, on the Marne, that the exhausted Allied armies were able to mount a fresh offensive. Beginning on September the 6th, the French Sixth Army attacked on the Germans' right flank. In turning to meet the attack, a 30-mile wide gap opened up, which the Allies were quick to exploit. In desperate fighting, 6,000 French reserve troops were ferried from Paris in a stream of taxis. It was enough to save the day, and the gap was further widened by a surprise attack launched by the French Fifth Army on September the 8th. Fearing an Allied breakthrough, the German Chief of Staff, Helmut von Moltke, ordered a retreat. They retreated for 40 miles to well-prepared defences on the River Aisne. There they would remain for the next 4 years. The Battle of the Marne was a strategic success for the French and the British, as they had succeeded in throwing back the German offensive and reclaiming some of the territory lost in the weeks before. It effectively ended any hopes the Germans may have had of bringing the war on the Western Front to an early close. It was also the end of the war of movement that had characterized the conflict thus far. From now on, the two sides settled into an increasingly familiar pattern of trench warfare. The Germans, dug into well-prepared defences, would have to be moved by Allied attacks. The cost had been high. The French suffered some 250,000 losses, the Germans a similar amount. The BEF had suffered a further 12,733 casualties. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war was going well for the Germans. At the beginning of August, two Russian armies had invaded eastern Prussia. General Samenov's Second Army had advanced from the southeast, and General Rennenkampf's First Army had advanced from the northeast. The plan was for the First Army to engage the Germans' Eighth Army under General Prittwitz in a frontal attack, while Samsonov's army engulfed the Germans from the rear. Initially the campaign went well, but Rennenkampf loathed Samsonov, and his personal vendetta was to result in a catastrophic defeat for the Russians at Tannenberg. The Germans, aware of the friction between the two commanders, intercepted uncoded messages between the two armies and were thus able to set a trap for the unwitting Samsonov. In the ensuing action, some 95,000 Russians were captured and 30,000 killed. Only 10,000 Russians managed to escape. Samsonov shot himself rather than face the disgrace of reporting the disaster. Tannenberg made the reputations of two German generals who would play a central role in the future conduct of the war: Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. The battles of the first month of the war had taken its toll on the tiny British expeditionary force. To Lord Kitchener, it was certain to last at least 3 years and not be over by Christmas, as popular opinion had it. The government refused to countenance conscription, and so Kitchener decided to capitalize on the mass patriotic fervor that had swept the country at the outbreak of the war. He initially called for 100,000 volunteers using one of the most famous advertising posters of all time. Men flooded into recruiting offices, and Kitchener dropped the 100,000 limit. By the end of 1914, over 1 million men had responded to his call. Rather than create new regiments, the new recruits were simply absorbed into new battalions. By the war's end, some regiments had over 40 battalions. Many of these new battalions were raised from men with a common interest or profession, or who came from the same town or city. They became universally known as Pals Battalions, and although the policy of keeping groups of men together may have played its part in maintaining morale, the high levels of casualties meant that whole communities were denuded of their menfolk after the war. The main problem with Kitchener's new armies was equipping, clothing and training them. Most of the regular officers had been sent to France, and so offers of help from former soldiers were gratefully accepted, even though some of their knowledge was hopelessly out of date. Other officers were found from public schools' officer training corps. They were given temporary commissions and were known by regulars rather disparagingly as temporary gentlemen. Rifles were also in short supply, and so early drill had to be performed using broomsticks. In France, the BEF was grappling with the new style of warfare. Trenches began scouring the French countryside from the Swiss border all the way up to the North Sea in Belgium. The BEF had learned, for example, that digging trenches on the forward slopes of hills made them easier to target by the enemy's artillery observers. Thus, they now began digging in on the reverse side of the slope. It was during the autumn that the war on the Western Front became mobile again. Each side began a series of maneuvers, heading northwards in an attempt to outflank the other. It became known as the race for the sea, but the result was further stalemate. The BEF found itself centered on the ancient Belgian cloth town of Ypres. Unpronounceable to most of the British Tommies, it became universally known as Wipers. It became a name synonymous with death and destruction, and the scene of some of the worst fighting on the Western Front. The surrounding countryside was low-lying and boggy, and the climate wet. As a result, water could not drain away, and trenches could not be dug deep enough without encountering more water. What high ground there was had been occupied by the Germans, leaving the British positions so exposed that canvas screens had to be erected in an attempt to obscure troop movements. Unable to make any progress in France, the Germans decided to try and punch through the BEF at Ypres. The British knew that there were no reserves behind them, and that if the Germans succeeded in breaking through, they would probably be able to take the Channel ports and so cut the BEF's communication with Britain. Both sides threw everyone who could be spared into the fray. As in Britain, there had been a rush of patriotic fervour throughout Germany at the outbreak of war. The universities were emptied as thousands of young idealistic men rushed to volunteer. At Ypres, they died in their thousands, cut down by deadly British rifle fire as they advanced in mass ranks as if on the parade ground. It became known in Germany as the Kindermord bei Ypres, or the Massacre of the Children of Ypres. The First Battle of Ypres lasted from mid-October until mid-November. The old British Army died in the Flanders mud, men whose experience would be sorely missed in the battles to come. Some 25,000 British soldiers died, and 50,000 Germans also perished. The Kaiser had ordered his army to walk over General French's contemptible little army. It was a name that stuck. In future, to be an old contemptible was to command respect. Both sides, exhausted and frustrated by their inability to make any kind of breakthrough, stopped to lick their wounds. Some were granted a few days' leave, but it was now clear that the war would not be over by Christmas. At sea, the war was also making little progress. The First World War had begun because, in part, of the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. But by the end of 1914, neither fleets had delivered a decisive result. At Coronel, off the coast of South America, a small German raiding force had delivered the Royal Navy's first defeat in centuries. Revenge had been swift, and the raiders had been caught and sunk off the Falkland Islands. But the event that shook the British deepest was the German attack on Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby on December the 16th, 1914. Even though the Royal Navy knew of the impending raid, Admiral Franz von Hipper was able to lead his force through to mount their attack. At approximately 8:10 on the morning of December the 16th, the guns unleashed their bombardment. By the time it had finished, the attack left 137 civilians dead and a further 592 wounded. To make matters worse, Hipper was able to slip away, although his ships had been damaged by artillery fire from two shore batteries. An outraged British public now demanded decisive action. Meanwhile in France, the Allies mounted their first offensive since the onset of trench warfare in the autumn. The trench lines had more or less stabilized, but Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, was determined to win the war quickly. The offensive was to be launched against the entire line from Nieuport in Belgium to Verdun, throughout the Artois and Champagne regions. In the event, the winter offensive was primarily directed against the German salient at Sailly, which bulged into central France, and a smaller salient that existed further south at Saint-Mihiel. Joffre's plan was to attack the Germans' Third Army with a numerically superior force on the Sailly salient and its northern and southern edges. A further attack in the Ardennes was to be launched with the objective of cutting off the Germans' line of retreat. A series of smaller attacks began on December the 10th, followed by heavier fighting on the 20th. But despite being outnumbered, the German lines were effectively entrenched. Once again, they demonstrated the superiority of defensive warfare over the then current state of offensive warfare. Infantry attacks across open ground failed repeatedly in the face of fortified machine gun positions. But the Allied commanders were convinced that infantry could prevail, especially as they believed that the eastern offensive against the Russians was beginning to draw battalions away from France. For the soldiers sheltering in their trenches, such grand strategies meant little. As Christmas drew near, their thoughts turned to home. The heady optimism of August, when everyone believed that it would be all over by Christmas, had been replaced by a grim realization that the war was likely to last a good deal longer. On Christmas Day, soldiers on both sides left their trenches and met in no man's land to exchange cigarettes and goodwill. It was something that soldiers down through the centuries had done before, but this time it had added poignancy, given the unprecedented carnage experienced by both sides. Although senior officers tried to put a stop to such fraternizing, the Christmas truce, as it became known, lasted all day in some sectors, even longer in others. But with celebrations over, the troops returned to their trenches to resume the war. Many must have hoped that perhaps they would be home by next Christmas. '15 was the first full year of the First World War. war of movement that had been a feature of the first weeks of the war had become bogged down in the stalemate of trench warfare. In Western Europe, the Germans had settled into well-prepared positions, often taking the valuable high ground. It meant that the French and their British allies would have to attack these defences if the Germans were to be defeated. '15 was to be a year of frustration for the Allies, as they tried in vain to force a breakthrough. There was also a widening of the conflict with the ill-fated attempt at a landing in Turkey in the Dardanelles, and the entry of Italy into the war on the side of the Allies. 1915 was also to see warfare take on a new dimension with the bombing of British cities by Zeppelin airships and the beginning of attacks of Allied and neutral shipping by German U-boats, a policy that would eventually bring the United States into the war. The year began with fighting in the Champagne and Artois sectors of the Western Front. Despite repeated attempts to dislodge them, the German defences were far superior, with well-prepared machine gun positions, taking a heavy toll on French attackers. Fighting continued without break until mid-February. There was a brief lull to reorganise before battle was resumed. But by mid-March, the entire offensive had been called off by the French, owing to the strength of German counterattacks and a costly lack of success. Champagne was to be the scene of another major offensive later in the year. Meanwhile, the war was about to take on a new deadly turn, in that it brought civilians hundreds of miles away into the sphere of combat. On the night of January the 19th, the German Navy launched the first with Zeppelin airships to attack the British mainland. This was the first of many raids, which continued at a rate of around 2 per month, in parallel with continuing reconnaissance patrols. The German Admiralty was very enthusiastic about the results and asked for permission to bomb London. This was only granted by the Kaiser after a series of raids by French bombers on German cities. On the 31st of May 1915, the first raid was carried out against London, killing 7 and injuring 35. The most successful Zeppelin raid on London in the entire war was on the 8th of September 1915. This raid caused more than £500,000 of damage, almost all of it from the one Zeppelin, the L-13, which managed to bomb central London. This single raid caused more than half the material damage caused by all the raids against Britain in 1915. Throughout the remainder of 1915, the Zeppelins raided London frequently and with impunity. They flew too high for most planes, and when they were intercepted by aircraft, the ammunition in use at the time had little effect. Despite this impunity, the material effect of the raids, with the exception of the L-13's success, was relatively slight. Navigation was very primitive, and as the war progressed, the British use of blackouts made it even harder. Bomb aiming was far from accurate. It is estimated that only 10% of the bombs dropped from Zeppelins actually hit their target. But the psychological impact of these raids was enough to cause the British to tie up 12 squadrons on home defence. Meanwhile at sea, the Germans declared their intent to starve Britain into submission by blockading her ports. But the Germans extended their blockade to include attacking ships flying neutral flags, including American vessels. What was particularly abhorrent was the attacks were carried out without warning, which was contrary to accepted rules of the sea. America was neutral, and there were many who wanted it to remain that way. But on May the 7th, a German U-boat sunk the Cunard liner Lusitania, killing over 1,100 civilians, including 128 Americans. The Lusitania had left New York on May the 1st. She was one of the fastest liners afloat, and even with one boiler shut down in order to preserve coal, she could still outrun a U-boat. As well as her passengers, she was carrying meat, medical supplies, copper, cheese, oil and machinery. But she was also secretly being loaded with munitions for Britain for the war. In order to try and deter passengers, the Germans placed an announcement in the newspaper next to Cunard's advertisement for her voyage. In it, they reminded readers that the Lusitania was regarded a legitimate target by the Germans. The warnings were dismissed as a propaganda ploy, and she set sail. Waiting for her off the coast of Ireland was U-20, whose captain already had earned a reputation for attacking without warning. A single torpedo struck Lusitania, to be followed by a mysterious second explosion. It was enough to send her to the bottom in around 20 minutes, before many of the lifeboats could be launched. When news of the attack reached the United States, there was outrage and widespread condemnation, resulting in a diplomatic crisis between Germany and the United States. Although the sinking of the Lusitania was not the reason that America eventually declared war on Germany in 1917, it certainly played a significant part in helping shape public opinion. In Britain, there was mounting criticism of the Royal Navy following the raid on the northeast by a squadron of German surface vessels. Public and political reaction in Britain expressed outrage that the German fleet could sail so close to the British coast and then proceed to shell coastal towns. Buoyed by the success of the raid, its commander, Admiral Franz von Hipper, planned another raid for the following month. He was, however, intercepted by the British on the 24th of January 1915 at Doggerbank, midway between Germany and Britain. The British had managed to intercept German wireless traffic thanks to a captured codebook. Consequently, Admiral David Beatty set sail with 5 battle cruisers to meet Hipper's 3. Realizing he was outnumbered, Hipper attempted to escape, believing the British battle cruisers to be relatively slow. But Beatty's cruisers were notably faster than their German counterparts, and they soon caught up with the raiders. But although a major British success appeared likely, Beatty, overcome by fears of mines and a false submarine sighting, decided to abandon the attack, allowing Hipper's squadron to escape. In March, Britain began blockading German ports. Although it would take time, it was to prove more successful than German attempts at similar action. Indeed, the British blockade played an important part in forcing the Germans to seek an armistice in 1918. By then, the country had all but run out of raw materials, and civilians were forced to forage through rubbish in search for food. In order to help combat the U-boat menace, a new type of armed merchantman was tried out. A gun was housed on the forward deck, which could be quickly prepared as soon as a U-boat surfaced to attack. Although the fighting along the Western Front had reached stalemate, the war in the East was going well for Germany. Following their success at Tannenberg the year before, there were some who questioned whether the Russians could recover, so great were their losses. At the end of January, the two sides clashed again at Bolimov, to the west of Warsaw in modern-day Poland. The battle was indecisive, although the Russians lost another 50,000 men. It was also the first time that the Germans used gas, although the freezing temperatures meant that the gas could not vaporize. Bolimov was the precursor to the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, which was intended to force Russia's defeat and so end the war on the Russian front. Also known as the Winter Battle because it opened during a severe blizzard, the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes was conceived by Paul von Hindenburg for a two-pronged decisive push against Russia by the Austrian and German armies. The plan was sanctioned by German Chief of Staff Erich Falkenhayn, albeit reluctantly, as he believed that victory in the West was within Germany's grasp. The battle began in a fierce snowstorm, but within a week, the Germans had advanced almost 70 miles against the Russian southern wing. As they fell back, the Russians were attacked from the north, this time against their right flank. In desperate fighting, the Russians fought off the German encirclement, allowing many to escape. They still suffered 56,000 casualties and many more taken prisoner. In order to try and bring relief to the hard-pressed Russians, the British devised a plan designed to knock Turkey out of the war and allow supplies through to Russia's Black Sea ports. The plan, the brainchild of British First Sea Lord to the Admiralty Winston Churchill, was to mount an amphibious assault on the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. Initially it was conceived as an entirely naval affair in which the Turkish forts that lined the narrow straits would be bombarded into submission by a large force of ships. This was soon recognized as unrealistic, not least because naval artillery could not be expected to achieve the necessary steep trajectory required to knock out the forts. Also, even if the naval bombardment had been successful, the absence of ground troops would have prevented the British from gaining command of the shorelines. And in the absence of supplies from the shore, the naval fleet would have had to return home to refuel and restock. Nevertheless, Churchill's plan was formally approved by the War Cabinet at the end of January 1915. The British War Minister, Lord Kitchener, ordered that the only available division of infantry be placed in readiness should the naval endeavour prove successful. On the 19th of February, the attack began, but the combined British and French force proved ineffective in the face of an efficient Turkish defensive system and poor Allied gunnery. What the Allies did not realise was that they had inflicted great damage and the Turkish defenders were also critically short of ammunition. But rather than call off the endeavour in failure, the British and French governments decided to press forward with a combined naval and ground expedition, the whole to be led by Lord Kitchener's former protégé, the newly appointed Sir Ian Hamilton. Hamilton was assigned a force of 75,000 men and a further 18,000 French colonial troops. Facing him were 84,000 Turkish troops led by an attached German officer, Lehmann von Sanders. Initially he had just 20,000 men and limited ammunition. Coupled with organizational difficulties, he feared that an invasion attempt would succeed. But he need not have feared, for Hamilton had inherited an equally, if not more, disorganized operation. Quite aside from being unsure what he was expected to achieve, the courteous Hamilton had set sail from England minus his staff and with the absence of informed intelligence concerning the Turkish defences. In the event, the landings took place at two locations on the 25th of April 1915, Cape Helles and Ariberno, which was soon renamed Anzac Cove. These were selected by Hamilton on the basis that their capture would assist the progress of the Allied battle fleet along the straits. "35,000 men landed at Cape Helles on the peninsula's southern tip at 5 locations. Further along the Aegean coast, the 17,000 men of the Australian and New Zealand Corps, the Anzacs, were landed at Ariberno and Gabi Tepe. As the defenders still had to get themselves organised, a single division was all that was available to keep the Allies back. Despite their disadvantage, the Turks performed remarkably well in holding back the 35,000 troops of the invasion force at Cape Helles. Of the 5 landing sites, 2 came under heavy Turkish machine gun fire. The remaining 3 sites were quickly secured, but indecision in the chain of command meant that the advantage was not taken. The Anzacs fared rather better. Having found their entire landing unopposed, they took full advantage by pushing into the heights which overlooked the entire peninsula. However, a resolute Turkish defence force, hastily assembled by Colonel Kemal, halted the Anzac advance, eventually forcing them back to the beaches by the day's close. The Allied position by the end of the 25th of April was not therefore an encouraging one. Although landings had been achieved, any further advances had not been possible. Turkish troops quickly surrounded the Allied force and in addition were in possession of the heights above the beachheads. Hamilton's force, finding itself short of necessary ammunition, was further handicapped by the requirement to use its artillery sparingly. Yet the Turkish fort similarly found itself unable to advance, finding it difficult to push Hamilton's solidly entrenched men back into the sea. Stalemate set in, along with a particularly unpleasant form of trench warfare, similar to that experienced on the Western Front. Hamilton's overall losses were heavy. Up to 1/3 of his force had suffered casualties. He consequently requested reinforcements from Kitchener in London. The latter ultimately obliged, but not without first having to face a barrage of criticism from British and French commanders on the Western Front, adamant that reserves could not be spared. Eventually reinforced at 12 divisions, Hamilton's next move came on the 6th of August 1915, with a further landing at Suvla Bay. The aim was to link up with the Anzacs at Anzac Cove and to sweep across the peninsula. At the same time, the forces at Hallas and Anzac Cove were to break out and link up with the new landing force. In planning both additional attacks, Hamilton was concerned to tie up as many Turkish troops as possible to guarantee the success of the fresh landings at Suvla Bay. Meanwhile, Turkish reinforcements continued to arrive on the peninsula, eventually building to 14 divisions. The landings were begun at 10 p.m. on the evening of the 6th of August. 20,000 troops landed at Suvla Bay with virtually no Turkish opposition, other than from sniper fire. The remainder of the British troops were successfully landed the following morning, albeit at disparate sites along the bay owing to reconnaissance failures. Delays in pressing forward allowed the Turks to bring up reinforcements, forcing the Allies back to their beachheads. Losses were predictably heavy. The Allies suffered approximately 18,000 casualties at Suvla Bay and at Anzac Cove, plus a further 3,500 at Hallas. The Turks suffered 18,000 casualties at Anzac Cove and anything from 9 to 20,000 at Suvla Bay. Once again, a state of trench warfare set in from Suvla. Attempts to link up with the forces at Hallas and Anzac Cove also ended in failure. Hamilton requested a further 95,000 reinforcements from British War Minister, but his request was turned down. With pressure mounting in France and a new attack at Salonika being planned, there were no reinforcements available. The only option was to evacuate, a decision supported by Kitchener himself following an inspection of the region. The British government, having prevaricated for several weeks, finally sanctioned an evacuation on the 7th of December. Unfortunately, by this stage, a heavy blizzard had set in, making such an operation hazardous. Nevertheless, the evacuation of 105,000 men and 300 guns from Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay was successfully conducted from the 10th to the 20th of December 1915. The evacuation of 35,000 men from Hallas was carried out from late December until 9th of January 1916. The evacuation operation was easily the most successful element of the entire campaign, with hardly any casualties. Painstaking efforts were made to deceive the 100,000 watching Turkish troops into believing that the movement of Allied troops did not constitute a withdrawal. 480,000 Allied troops have participated in the Gallipoli campaign. Of this figure, 252,000 were casualties, including 48,000 fatalities. Turkish casualties have been estimated at 250,000, of which at least 65,000 were believed to be fatalities. In the spring of 1915, attention turned back to the Western Front. At Neuf-Chapelle, to the west of Lille in northwest France, the Germans held a small salient. On the 10th of March, the British and French forces launched an attack to reduce the salient. Leading the attack was Douglas Haig's First Army. The assault began with an artillery barrage that lasted for 35 minutes. 342 guns pounded the Germans across a 2,000-yard line, supported by reconnaissance aircraft from the Royal Flying Corps. During the barrage, more shells were fired than at the whole of the Boer War, a sobering reflection on the transformation of warfare in the space of 15 years. Four divisions of 40,000 men were committed along a 3-kilometer front. The infantry found themselves often locked in hand-to-hand fighting, but initial progress was rapid. The British Expeditionary Force found itself quickly breaking through a section of the German line secured by only a single division of Crown Prince Ruprecht's 6th Army at Neuf-Chapelle village. It had taken just 4 hours to secure the village. Having achieved a real gain in the capture of the village, supply and communication problems began to plague Haig's troops. Rupprecht dispatched reserves to Neuve-Chapelle, launching a counterattack on the 12th of March. The British, nevertheless, managed to hold their gains, some 2 kilometers of ground originally lost in October 1914. But further progress towards the village of Ubers, which was the French objective, proved impossible. Of some 1,000 troops who attacked Ubers, none survived. The attack was consequently halted on the 13th of March. Allied casualties during the battle were 11,200. Losses among the German Sixth Army were roughly similar, although 1,200 German troops were also captured by the British. Sir John French, the BEF's commander-in-chief, in part blamed a shortage of artillery shells for the lack of success beyond the initial advance. Shell production in Britain was unable to keep up with the demands of what was clearly going to be a long war. Following the intervention of Lord Northcliffe's Daily Mail, a new Ministry of Munitions was created under David Lloyd George. French decided that the BEF should stockpile greater quantities of shells in the future. But in extending the duration of such bombardments, the vital element of surprise vital to such attacks was lost, giving the Germans valuable additional time in which to prepare. Following the failure of the Allies' attack at Neuve-Chapelle, it was the turn of the Germans to attack, this time at Ypres in Belgium. It was to be the Germans' only major attack on the Western Front in 1915, as their efforts were concentrated on defeating the Russians. Indeed, the main aim of the offensive was to divert Allied attention away from the east. Second, Ypres, as the offensive is now known, is generally remembered as marking the first use of gas on the Western Front. Although introduced with minimum effect on the Russian Eastern Front at Bonomov by the Germans early in the year, its impact during Second Ypres was startlingly effective, even though its use was in conflict with the Hague Convention, which outlawed gas warfare. 5,700 canisters containing 168 tons of chlorine gas were released at sunset on the 22nd of April against French, Algerian and Territorial Division troops, following a brief preliminary bombardment by 17-inch howitzers. A veil of greenish-yellow mist could be seen rolling across from the German front lines to the French positions. The terrified Allied troops fled in panic towards Ypres, the heavy gas settling and clogging the trenches where it gathered. Covering 4 miles of trench lines, the gas affected some 10,000 troops, half of whom died within 10 minutes of the gas reaching the front line. Death was caused by asphyxiation. Those who lived were temporarily blinded and stumbled in confusion, coughing heavily. 2,000 of these troops were taken as prisoners of war. The 2 advancing German corps, wearing primitive respirators, paced warily through a clear 7-kilometer gap in the Allied lines. In planning the attack, no reserves had been thought necessary, the German command considering it inconceivable that a major breakthrough could be achieved. Indeed, German commanders were completely taken by surprise at the success of the attack. In consequence, the actual breakthrough was not exploited to the full. After advancing 3 kilometers into Allied lines, the Germans halted under a hail of a hastily prepared counteroffensive by the British Second Army. Even so, the loss of high ground to the north significantly weakened the Allied position. The Germans released a second batch of chlorine gas 2 days later, on the 24th of April, this time directed against Canadian troops situated northeast of Ypres, and again prefaced by a sharp artillery bombardment. Again, the German forces gained ground against the unprotected Canadian troops, although fighting was fierce, spreading far south to the area called Hill 60. But gas warfare was losing its impact, as it was relatively easy to protect troops from the effects of chlorine gas by issuing them with simple face masks. in the fierce fighting that followed. General Smith-Dorrien proposed a 2.5-mile withdrawal close to Ypres. He felt that nothing short of a large-scale counter-offensive was likely to push the German forces back to their original positions. The idea was not well received by the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, who effectively dismissed Smith-Dorrien by sending him home to England. Ironically, Smith-Dorrien's replacement, General Herbert Plumer, also recommended a general withdrawal to French. This time, the suggestion was accepted. On the 24th of May, a heavy German assault forced a further Allied withdrawal. But the Germans were also running out of supplies and manpower, and so they were obliged to call off the offensive. Instead, they resorted to pummeling the ancient town with artillery, intent on reducing it to rubble. Even so, the German attack had considerably reduced the size of the Allied salient. The highest ground had been lost, and it was no more than 3 miles across and 5 miles deep. Losses during the Second Battle of Ypres were estimated at 69,000 Allied troops against 35,000 German troops. This time the difference in numbers was explained by the use of chlorine gas. But its use in Belgium only put further strain on Germany's already fragile relations with the still neutral United States. From now on, gas was used by both sides with mixed success. The British first used gas during the Battle of Loos, begun in early May, while fighting was still going on to the north of Ypres. It formed part of a wider offensive in the Artois region by British and French forces. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre and British commanders relied upon numerical supremacy, sometimes as much as 3-1 in favour of the French, to overpower the Germans. But attacks at Vimy Ridge near Arras had not been successful. The Loos offensive began on the 25th of September, following a 4-day artillery bombardment in which 250,000 shells were fired. But it was deemed a failure as the German defences were found intact, and so was called off on the 28th of September. Despite serious misgivings, Douglas Haig, the British commander, committed 6 divisions to the attack. He was much concerned at both a marked shortage in available shells and at the fatigued state of his troops, who were suffering from fatigue. He was also concerned at the nature of the difficult terrain that would need to be crossed. Set against these concerns, however, was the reality that the British enjoyed massive numerical supremacy against their German opposition at Loos, in places of 7-1. Once the preliminary artillery bombardment had concluded, Haig's battle plans called for the release of 5,100 cylinders of chlorine gas, the equivalent of 140 tons. The quantity of gas used was designed to entirely overcome the primitive state of German gas mask design in use at the time. Unfortunately, the release of gas was not a great success. In places, the wind blew the gas back into the British trenches, resulting in 2,632 British gas casualties, although only 7 actually died. After several days of sporadic fighting, the British were eventually forced to order a retreat. It was during this battle that Rudyard Kipling's son John was lost, believed killed. The fact that he was listed as missing sparked a crusade by his parents to locate his body and give it a proper burial, but without success. Their grief only served to highlight a burden that was being endured by thousands of parents throughout the country. The Loos attack was renewed by the British on the 13th of October, when further heavy losses, combined with poor weather, caused the offensive to be called off. During the battle, the British suffered 50,000 casualties. German casualties were estimated much lower, at approximately half the British total. The British failure at Loos contributed to the replacement of Sir John French as Commander-in-Chief by Douglas Haig at the end of 1915. Elsewhere, French progress along the Champagne part of the front was limited, despite early successes. As the Allies were beginning to learn, the Germans were too well dug in. All too often, artillery barrages were failing to cut the fields of barbed wire that lay in front of the German trenches. Also, German machine guns were usually well positioned in what amounted to small fortresses, reinforced with concrete. Even if the assault troops managed to find their way through the wire, they often found that the artillery had had little effect on the deeply dug German bunkers. The Germans were also marshalling their reserves well. They were keeping only a minimum number of men necessary to hold a sector, while holding a much larger number of men back in their second-line defences, out of range of the artillery. Once the barrage came to an end, these forces were sent forward to launch a counterattack. The attack was usually successful, as the numbers of attacking troops had been whittled down by the machine guns. The losses and conditions in Flanders and western France were appalling. But along the Italian front they reached new depths. The Italians had come into the war in May 1915 on the side of the Allies. Most of the fighting was to be concentrated along the Isonzo River, which is located in present-day Slovenia. During the First World War, however, the 60-mile-long river ran north to south just inside Austria, along its border with Italy at the head of the Adriatic Sea. It was difficult terrain, as it was flanked by mountains on either side. The 400-mile front was mountainous and dominated by the Austrians, who had anticipated that Italy would eventually come into the war. Chief of Staff Luigi Cardogna judged that their best chance of success lay in attacking across the coastal plain east of the lower end of the Isonzo. However, he also believed that the Italian army could strike further north and bypass the mountains either side of the river, so as to come at the Austro-Hungarians in the rear. but he expected operations in the Isonzo sector to be far from easy. He was also well aware that the river was prone to flooding, made worse by record rainfalls during 1914-18. There would be some 12 battles along the Isonzo, all of which either ended in stalemate or disaster. In 1915, there were 4 battles along the Isonzo. Although the Italians had numerical superiority, the Austro-Hungarian forces occupied most of the mountains overlooking the river. Thus they were content to defend and let the Italians try and dislodge them. Cardogna had every intention of attacking at this point and had steadily built up his forces accordingly before Italy's declaration of war. But the Austro-Hungarians also knew what he was going to do, and so they also had time to prepare. The first battle of the Isonzo began on the 23rd of June. But the Italians were making the same mistake as commanders on the Western Front, sending infantry to assault well-prepared defences without sufficient artillery support. After 2 weeks of fighting in which the Italians only achieved small gains, the attack was called off. But the respite was to be brief, as the second battle at the Isonzo was launched on the 18th of July. Thus the pattern was set. During the battle that followed, the Italians never did succeed in crossing the river and holding the far bank, let alone making any serious territorial gains. Cumulative casualties of the numerous battles of the Isonzo were enormous. Half of the entire Italian war casualty total of 600,000 was suffered along the Isonzo. Austro-Hungarian losses, while by no means as numerous, were nevertheless high, at around 200,000 out of an overall total of around 1.2 million casualties. 1915 ended with the Allies making their withdrawal from Gallipoli. In many ways, that event typified their fortunes throughout 1915. Small gains at enormous cost in men's lives, only to be forced back to their start lines. But there was to be no respite. In 1916, the suffering was set to continue, achieving new depths in the scale of slaughter. '16 was to be the year of titanic battles. Lord Kitchener's call for 100,000 volunteers had been easily met, so there were subsequent calls for further 100,000s. By the spring of 1916, the BEF had 6 new Kitchener armies. It had increased tenfold in its size since peace. Of the 70 divisions now under arms, 24 were new army divisions, either already on or waiting to go to the Western Front. The BEF also had a new commander, Sir Douglas Haig. Haig and the French commander Joffre began planning a major offensive along the Somme River. But the Germans were also making plans of their own. In the coming months, both sides would clash in the bloodiest phase of the war to date. The Germans' aim was to engage the French in a battle of attrition, which would, in the Germans' words, bleed France white. The killing fields were to be Verdun. The German siege of Verdun and its ring of forts, which comprised the longest battle of the First World War, has its roots in a letter sent by the German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, to the Kaiser Wilhelm II on Christmas Day 1915. In his letter, Falkenhayn argued that the key to winning the war lay not on the Eastern Front against Russia, whom he believed was on the point of revolution and subsequent withdrawal from the war, but on the Western Front. He reasoned that if France could be defeated in a major set-piece battle, Britain would in all likelihood seek terms with Germany or else be defeated in turn. Falkenhayn believed that Britain formed the foundation of the Allied effort ranged against Germany, and that she must be removed from the war. To that end, he recommended implementation of a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare against merchant shipping, a policy directed squarely at starving Britain. This, combined with a knockout blow to France, would, he believed, bring about a successful conclusion to hostilities. The Kaiser acted upon Falkenhayn's recommendations, agreeing to the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, dangerous as it was, running the risk of bringing the US into the war. He also sanctioned implementation of the set-piece siege against Verdun, Falkenhayn's choice of French target, starting in February 1916. In so doing, he agreed to switch focus from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. This latter strategy was not without its critics. In particular, Paul von Hindenburg argued the opportunity was lost to capture the bulk of the Russian army. Falkenhayn's choice of Verdun as the focus of the German offensive was shrewd. France had lost faith in the value of fortress defences during the early stages of the war, and so Verdun was relegated to the status of a minor fortress. But Verdun maintained a great psychological hold on the minds of the French people. A fortress had stood there since Roman times. On a practical level, the woods immediately behind Verdun would have proved far easier to defend than the Verdun forts. The last fortress town to fall to the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, Verdun's fortifications had been significantly boosted in the 1880s to withstand further attacks. Falkenhayn's plan was to subject Verdun to intense bombardment, thus drawing in and diverting French troops from all over the Western Front to the 8-mile-wide front around Verdun. Falkenhayn's stated aim was to bleed France white in its defense of the ancient fortress town. The fact that Verdun formed a French salient into German lines only served to help Falkenhayn, since it meant that it was open to attack from 3 sides at once. The task of besieging Verdun fell to the German Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm. He planned to assault the town from both sides of the surrounding Meuse River, a plan vetoed by Falkenhayn, who, cautious by nature, feared heavy losses. Instead, he ordered the attack to be confined to the eastern bank of the river. Originally scheduled to start on the 12th of February, the offensive was postponed to the 21st of February on account of poor weather, preceded by a 21-hour preliminary bombardment. In the meantime, French Commander-in-Chief Joffre received intelligence of the imminent attack, hastily deploying reinforcements to the French Second Army. Meanwhile, the fortress commander, Lieutenant Colonel Émile Drouin, vainly attempted to improve Verdun's trench systems in time. Drouin prepared for the onslaught by posting 2 battalions, led by himself at the tip of the Verdun salient, on the east bank of the Meuse River. He faced formidable opposition, 1 million German troops against 200,000 defenders. The attack finally began at 7:15 on the 21st of February. Crown Prince Wilhelm opening the battle with 1,400 guns packed along the 8-mile front. The guns were well served by good railway facilities nearby. 100,000 shells poured into Verdun every hour. Wilhelm's intention being to kill the majority of the French defenders before the infantry even started their advance into the fortress. Following an optimistic assessment, a German scouting party was sent in following the initial bombardment. They reported that half the French fighting force remained to meet the planned attack. Arguably, had Wilhelm chosen to attack at this point, the fortress might still have fallen. Instead, daunted by the apparent formidable defences, Wilhelm chose to renew the bombardment. By the close of the first day, the German forces had succeeded only in capturing the French front-line trenches, much less than planned. But Durand himself had been killed during the battle, and his 2 battalions demolished. Wilhelm withdrew his forward infantry in preparation for a further artillery bombardment, thus taking the sting out of the momentum that had been generated. More importantly, it allowed the French defenders to position themselves such that they're able to enfilade the advancing German troops from across the river. Verdun remained in French hands, although the defensive situation was dire. A message was sent to French headquarters on the 23rd of February, reporting that Durand had been lost, as had the company commanders, and that the battalion had been reduced from 600 to around 180 men. The following day, 24th of February, German troops succeeded in overrunning the French second line of trenches, forcing the defenders to within 8 kilometers of Verdun itself. Nevertheless, 2 outer forts, Vaux and Douaumont, continued to hold out. A French division sent in piecemeal that same day was dispersed under heavy German artillery fire. The next day, Douaumont fell. The effect on French morale of the loss was marked, both upon the remaining defenders and the freshly arrived reinforcements. Popular French sentiment within the country demanded its recapture. Withdrawal from Verdun was therefore politically impossible. The French Commander-in-Chief Joffre remained unflappable. He issued a statement noting that any commander who gave ground to the advancing Germans would be court-martialed. He summarily dismissed General Langle de Carey, who was responsible for the defense of Verdun, for deciding to evacuate the Yuvre Plain and the east bank of the Meuse River. In Langle de Carey's place, Joffre promoted Henri-Philippe Pétain, a talented officer whose progress through the French army had been slowed on account of his defiance of the prevailing motto of attack at all costs, believing that this was a recipe for disaster. He was one of a few commanders who recognized that defensive technology had advanced more rapidly than offensive technology. Pétain pledged not to let the Germans pass and telephoned the commander of the Verdun front line, instructing him to hold fast. In a sense, Petain's appointment could hardly have better suited Falkenhayn's ultimate goal. His stated aim of bleeding the French army at Verdun would not be met by a quick German victory. Thus, Petain's dogged determination to hold out suited his intentions perfectly. However, he could hardly have determined just how effective Petain's defensive strategies turned out to be. Pétain understood that the defense of Verdun would result in many French casualties. The nature of the terrain made this inevitable. However, he was determined to inflict the maximum damage to the German invaders in the course of those losses. Hence he effectively reorganized French use of artillery, personally taking command of this aspect of the defense. He also took action to ensure that an effective supply route to Verdun was maintained. A single narrow road was to become Verdun's single artery to the outside world and its supply depot 50 miles to the west. The road came to be known as Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Road. On the 6th of March, the Germans began a fresh offensive after receiving fresh artillery supplies. They made great progress at first until French counterattacks pushed back the advancing German infantry. For the remainder of the month, Wilhelm launched repeated attacks against French reinforcements, constantly pouring into the fortress. Of the 330 infantry regiments of the French army, 259 eventually fought at Verdun. Falkenhayn reluctantly committed another corps of men to attack up the left bank of the Meuse River towards a small ridge named Le Mort Homme, or the Dead Man. It lived up to its grim name as the battle raged continuously without conclusion. Meanwhile, the casualties were mounting rapidly on both sides. The French were certainly losing huge numbers of men, as were the Germans. By the time the battle ended, almost 1 million casualties had been incurred in roughly equal numbers on either side. April the 9th saw the launch of the third major German offensive, this time on both sides of the salient. Again, Pétain's defenses held. The attacks and counterattacks continue until the end of May. The German forces were inching ever closer to the remaining forts. During this period, Pétain was promoted and was replaced at Verdun by the aggressive Robert Nivelle. Mottholm Hill was finally secured by the Germans on the 29th of May, and finally on the 7th of June, Fort Vaux fell. Situated on the east bank of the Meuse River, the fort had held out against constant bombardment since the start of the battle in February. However, by now out of reserves of water and the fort itself lying in ruins, its French defenders could hold out no longer. With the capture of the fort, Wilhelm offered his congratulations to the fort commander, Major Ranal, for holding out so long. Encouraged by the success in capturing Fort Vaux, German troops almost succeeded in breaking through the French line at the close of June and into early July. It was at this stage that the latest form of chemical warfare was unveiled by Germany, phosgene gas, which acted by forming as hydrochloric acid once inhaled into the lungs. Joffre, meanwhile, pressed the British government to stage a major diversionary offensive elsewhere on the Western Front, in order to drain German manpower and so relieve the pressure at Verdun. Originally scheduled for the 1st of August, the Battle of the Somme was brought forward to the 1st of July on Joffre's insistence. Beginning of the Russians' Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front. 15 German divisions had to be withdrawn from Verdun to aid in the defense on the east. German losses were proving as costly as the French. Falkenhayn was blamed for the lack of success at Verdun. As a result, Falkenhayn was dismissed by the Kaiser. His replacement as Chief of Staff was Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg was not convinced that Verdun was worth continuing. On the 24th of October, Douaumont was recaptured, followed by Fort Vaux on the 2nd of November. Following a pause, the French renewed the offensive, retaking ground lost since the start of the German attack. Between the 15th to the 18th of December alone, when the battle ended, the French captured 11,000 prisoners, and with them 115 heavy guns. French casualties during the battle were estimated at 550,000, with German losses set at 434,000, half the total being fatalities. The only real effect of the battle was the irrevocable wounding of both armies. No tactical or strategic advantage had been gained by either side. "1916 saw one of the greatest naval engagements of all time, as well as the one significant sea battle of the First World War. Jutland had all the elements to be a great British naval victory, but in the event the result was much less clear-cut. The recently appointed commander of the German High Seas Fleet, Reinhard Scheer, had returned to the policy of making sorties against the British coast, confident that his codes were secure, and thus that the main British battle fleet at Scapa Flow in the north of Scotland could not intervene. But the British could read German coded messages and were aware of Scheer's plan. On the 31st of May, 152 ships of the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet set sail soon after the Germans' High Seas Fleet. The plan was for BT to sail ahead of the main force and bomb Zeppelin sheds using aircraft. It was expected that this would lure the Germans out into the open sea, where they would be pounced upon by the main force led by BT's Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Jellicoe. For the first time since Trafalgar, Britain's Royal Navy was to engage the enemy in a set-piece encounter. England expected a famous victory. But in the vast grey expanse of the North Sea, they could have missed each other, but fate was to bring them together at Jutland. The first phase began when BT engaged Hipper's squadron. Hipper turned south, leading BT towards the main fleet. The second phase saw BT flee north, pursued by the German dreadnoughts. So far, both sides thought the battle was going to plan, even though 2 British battle cruisers had already been lost. Now in the third phase, the Germans got an unpleasant surprise. Thinking themselves involved in a chase that would end with the destruction of the British battle cruisers, they found themselves under bombardment from Jellicoe's battle fleet, which they had thought to be too far north to intervene. The heavy British guns quickly forced Scheer to order a retreat. But then Scheer made what could have turned into a grievous error, turning back, possibly hoping to pass Jellicoe and escape into the Baltic. Jellicoe had slowed down, and the German fleet found themselves crossing in front of the British fleet. And in 10 minutes of gunfire, suffered 27 heavy hits, while only inflicting 2. Once again, Scheer ordered a retreat. in the last phase of the battle, in a night of intense fighting, the retreat of the German battleships was covered by their lighter ships, while Jellicoe lost time after turning to avoid a potential torpedo attack. The Germans lost 1 battlecruiser, 1 pre-dreadnought, 4 light cruisers and 5 destroyers, while the British lost 3 battlecruisers, 4 armoured cruisers and 8 destroyers. But many of the surviving German heavy ships had suffered serious damage, and one result of the battle was to increase the British dominance in heavy ships. Jutland was the last and largest of the great battleship battles. Neither submarines or aircraft played any part in the battle, despite the plans of both sides. Never again did battle fleets meet again in such numbers. While the Royal Navy suffered more losses, the battle effectively ended any threat from the High Seas Fleet, which now knew it could not contest control of the North Sea with the Royal Navy. The one great sea battle of the First World War had ended in anticlimax. The inconclusive outcome of the battle, involving some 250 warships, lasting over 12 hours, and covering an area larger than the Irish Sea, dealt a shattering blow to British self-assurance. At Verdun, the French were being drawn in ever-increasing numbers. In order to relieve the pressure, there was great pressure put on the British to mount a major offensive in order to draw German forces away. The offensive was planned late in 1915 and was intended as a joint French-British attack. The French commander-in-chief, Joffre, conceived the idea of a battle of attrition, the aim being to drain the German forces of reserves, although territorial gain was a secondary aim. The plan was agreed upon by the new British commander-in-chief, Sir Douglas Haig, although he would have preferred an offensive across the open ground of Flanders. Although British forces comprised by far the bulk of the offensive forces, Joffre and Haig originally intended for the attack to be a predominantly French offensive. However, the German onslaught at Verdun resulted in the diversion of virtually all French manpower and efforts. Haig took over responsibility from Joffre for the planning and execution of the attack. Haig's meticulous preparations progressed slowly, much to Joffre's irritation. Haig intended to fashion the attack using the ideas of both himself and General Rawlinson, whose Fourth Army was to spearhead the assault. The Germans had held the high ground around the Somme since the first weeks of the war. The hard, chalky soil was ideal for mining. Thus the Germans had dug deep bunkers with high-sided communication trenches to the rear. Their bunkers were well provisioned to withstand a long siege. On the surface, machine gun positions covered every possible angle of attack. In front of them were fields of barbed wire. The British and French, on the other hand, regarded the Somme as a quiet sector, and so were behind in their preparations when the attack began. German lines, beginning on Saturday, June the 24th. The expectation was that the ferocity of the bombardment would entirely destroy all forward German defences, enabling the attacking British troops to practically walk across no man's land and take possession of the German front lines from the battered and dazed German troops. 1,500 British guns, together with a similar number of French guns, were employed in the bombardment. Following the artillery bombardment, it was determined that a creeping barrage would precede the advancing infantry to the German front line, and onwards to the second and third trench lines. The Royal Artillery had prepared an underground network of telephone cables so as to enable forward observation officers to monitor and correct the ranges as the battle progressed. With the conclusion of the advanced bombardment, Rawlinson's southern wing at the centre of the attack line was instructed by Haig to consolidate after a limited advance. Rawlinson's troops went into battle heavy laden with supplies for that purpose. Meanwhile, to the north, the rest of the Fourth Army, in addition to one corps of General Allenby's Third Army, attempted to complete a breakthrough, with cavalry standing by to fully exploit a hoped-for gap in the German lines. As a former cavalryman, Haig was convinced the coup de grace of the attack would best be carried out by cavalry troops. Following the taking of the German lines, the plan was for the British to break through to Cambrai and Douai, thus breaking the German line in two. Further south, a subsidiary advance by the French Sixth Army was scheduled to start operations at the same time as one corps. 27 divisions of men went into the attack, 750,000 men, of which over 80% were from the British Expeditionary Force. Ranged against them in the German trenches were 16 divisions of the German Second Army. The odds were apparently stacked heavily in the attacking force's favour. But the advanced artillery bombardment failed to destroy either the German frontline barbed wire or the heavily built concrete bunkers the Germans had carefully constructed. Much of the munitions used by the British proved to be duds, badly manufactured and ineffective. Many charges did not go off. Even today, farmers on the Western Front unearth many tons of unexploded iron harvest each year. During the bombardment, the German troops sought shelter in their deep bunkers, emerging only when the British artillery bombardment finished. Then the German machine guns were manned to deadly effect. The attack itself began at 7:30 on the 1st of July with the detonation of a series of 17 mines. The first, which was actually exploded 10 minutes early, went off at 7:20, giving the Germans just enough warning of the impending attack. The first attacking wave of the offensive went over the top from Gommecourt to the French left flank just south of Montauban. The attack was by no means a surprise to the German forces. Quite aside from being freely discussed in French coffee shops and in letters home from the front, the chief effect of the 8-day preliminary bombardment served merely to alert the German army to imminent attack. As a consequence of the lack of surprise generated by the advanced bombardment and the lack of success in cutting the German barbed wire and in damaging the underground bunkers, the BEF made strikingly little progress on the 1st July or in the days and weeks that followed. Success was achieved by the French forces at the southern tail of the line, possibly because their advanced bombardment was sprung only hours before the attack, thus ensuring a degree of surprise. In addition, von Falkenhayn believes that the French would not attack at all on account of their heavy losses at Verdun. By advancing in small groups as they had at Verdun, the French troops achieved most of their objectives. The British troops were, for the most part, forced back into their trenches by the effectiveness of the German machine gun response. Many troops were killed or wounded the moment they stepped out of the front lines into no man's land. Slowly towards the German lines, laden down with supplies, expecting little or no opposition. They made incredulously easy targets of the German machine gunners. Despite heavy losses during the first day, 58,000 British troops alone, Haig persisted with the offensive in the following days. Advances were made, but these were limited and often ultimately repulsed. Rawlinson's forces secured the first line of German trenches on the 11th of July. On that day, German troops were transferred from Verdun, doubling the number of men available for the defense. On the 19th of July, the German defense was reorganized, with the southern wing forming a new army, First Army. Each side assumed the other was on the point of exhaustion and that a breakthrough was imminent. Thus the offensive was maintained throughout the summer and into November. But the British saw few victories. Poitiers was captured by 2 Australian divisions on July the 23rd, and those that were secured were not followed up. early September, the French 10th Army joined the attack on a 20-kilometre front to the south. Meanwhile, the British attack was renewed by the 4th Army in the northeast at Flers-Courcellette. The latter attack made use of tanks for the first time and deployed 15 divisions of men. Even so, it gained under a kilometre of ground. The first tanks were developed in great secrecy, but there were only 50 available. Mechanical and other failures reduced the original number of participating tanks to 24. Whilst they achieved a large measure of shock surprise when sprung upon the German opposition, these early tanks proved unwieldy and highly unreliable. The tanks were rolled out at 6:20 on the morning of 15th of September. General Gough's forces moved to force the enemy off the northern end of the main ridge and away from the 4th Army. Rawlinson's troops were to break through the remaining enemy trench system, while the French 6th Army would attempt to clear the enemy from the British right flank. Meanwhile, the Canadians were northwest of the Albert-Bapaume road and outpaced their 7 tanks to capture Corliette. Immediately south of them, the 15th Scottish Division, held by a single tank, captured Marty-Pieck. To the southeast, however, German forces in high wood swept the ground with fire from each end, halting a number of tanks. Others found themselves lost, while yet others fired on their own infantry. To the east, progress to Flers was helped by the arrival of 4 tanks at a critical moment. The ruined village falling to a single tank, assisted by mixed platoons of Hampshires and Royal West Kents. Haig renewed attacks in this area again between the 25th and 27th of September, but British advances were small. Other attacks were launched by the British at the battles of Transloy Ridges and the Battle of the Ancre Heights. Similarly, French attacks were continued in the south around Chalnez and the centre east of Malval. In October, Joffre urged Haig to continue the offensive, but this time the French forces in Verdun were on the offensive and were gaining ground. Joffre was concerned that Haig should keep up the pressure on the Germans so as to prevent a diversion of German manpower back to Verdun to assist with the German defence there. On the 13th of November, the BEF made a final effort on the far east of the salient in the Battle of the Ancre, in which they captured the field fortress of Belmont-Hamel. Despite the slow but progressive British advance, poor weather and snow brought the Somme offensive to a halt on the 18th of November. During the attack, the British and French had gained 12 kilometres of ground, but the cost had been enormous. 420,000 estimated British casualties, including many of the volunteers' PALS battalions, plus a further 200,000 French casualties. German casualties were estimated at around 500,000. Sir Douglas Haig's conduct of the battle caused, and still causes, great controversy. Critics argue that his inflexible approach merely repeated flawed tactics. Others argue that Haig's hand was forced and that the Somme offensive was necessary in order to relieve the French at Verdun. In any event, the Battle of the Somme passed into the British national consciousness as a byword for the unnecessary slaughter and loss of so many lives being claimed by the First World War. Whilst the Allies were slogging it out in France, the Russians at last tasted success, to the point that they nearly succeeded in knocking the Austro-Hungarians out of the war. The Trentino offensive, launched in early May, was the Austro-Hungarians' first attack against the Italians. They were making great gains until the ruggedness of the terrain began slowing them down, allowing the Italians to regroup. Quick thinking by the Italian Chief of Staff, Luigi Cardone, resulted in 500,000 men being rushed from the Isonzo to the Trentino. At the same time, Cardone appealed to his Russian ally to launch an offensive that would draw the Austro-Hungarians away. Commanded by Alexei Bruzhilov, the Russians opened their offensive at Lutz on the 4th of June. Although the Austro-Hungarians outnumbered the Russians and they believed their fortified positions to be impregnable, Russian artillery succeeded in breaching the barbed wire in more than 50 places. In 2 days of fighting, the Austro-Hungarians lost some 130,000 troops. But the Russian steamroller continued until shortage of supplies meant the offensive trickled to a standstill during September. The Austro-Hungarians paid a high price for their complacency. Some 1.5 million men were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. As 1916 closed, there was a glimmer of hope when the Germans issued a peace note suggesting a compromise peace. The war at the beginning of 1917 looked very similar to the war of 1915, with trench systems dividing Europe into two armed camps. France, the trenches stretched 400 miles from the Swiss border all the way to Newport on the Belgian coast. The depth of this ribbon of death and destruction was around 10,000 yards, defined by the maximum range of artillery. Villages had completely disappeared, and the major towns such as Albert, Arras and Rheims badly damaged. But beyond the range of the heavy artillery, life went on more or less as normal, at least on the Allies' side of the line. Away from the front line, soldiers could rest and recuperate. Equipment could be stored and repaired in huge service yards. On the German side, life was hard. The Royal Navy's blockade was beginning to bite, leading to shortages. Austere economic measures were introduced that saw France and Belgium plundered for food and labour. On the 1st of February, Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. As a result, the US severed diplomatic links with Germany. The sinking without warning of unarmed ships was too much for the American public and would become a significant factor in bringing the United States into the war later in the year. Germany was prepared to brazen it out, believing that her submarines would prevent American troops from crossing the Atlantic should the United States come into the war on the Allies' side. But 1917, the fourth year of the war, was to see more carnage and destruction. For some, it had become too much to bear, and mutiny was in the air. The French army was all but paralyzed by mutinies. But the most catastrophic mutiny of all occurred in the Russian army. After 3 years of fighting, Russia had suffered enormous losses on the battlefield and was now faced with food and fuel shortages. There were strikes and riots breaking out in cities all over Russia. Dissatisfied with the army's conduct of the war, Nicholas had taken personal command in September 1915. But continuing military disasters reflected badly on the new Supreme Commander rather than the Army Command. Consequently, Nicholas's popularity dwindled. By late 1916, royalists within the Duma, the Russian parliament, warned the Tsar that revolution was imminent. Even so, Nicholas refused to sanction further constitutional reform. During the so-called February Revolution in 1917, which he misinterpreted as a minor uprising, his routine suppression orders to the Petrograd garrison sparked its mutiny on the 10th of March. Nicholas II was persuaded to abdicate on the 15th of March 1917, following the recommendation of the Russian Army High Command. In search of exile elsewhere, Lloyd George offered a haven in Britain, only for the offer to be withdrawn under the direction of King George V, who did not wish to be associated with his autocratic cousin. Moved to the Siberian city of Ekaterinburg by the Bolsheviks, Nicholas and his family were executed on the night of the 16th-17th of July 1918. But the new government under Alexander Kerensky fared little better. A large offensive was launched against the German army, but it quickly turned to a failure. At this point, the entire Russian army began to fall apart and walk away. Entire army groups left the trenches, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers deserted. The Germans, exploiting the problems unfolding in Russia, mounted a fresh offensive in the north. They succeeded in capturing Riga, which was the most important of the Baltic ports. The collapse of Kerensky's leadership created a vacuum, which the Bolsheviks, now led by Lenin, were ready to fill. A second revolution in October brought the Bolsheviks to power. For the Russians, the Great War was essentially over, but a cruel and vicious civil war was about to begin. The collapse of the Russian army allowed Germany to begin moving its best troops to the Western Front to face England and France. Planning also began for a large offensive in France for the next year, 1918. With relations with the United States at breaking point, the Germans were all too aware that if they were to defeat the Allies, then it would have to be before American forces arrived in France. The final push that drove the United States to war was a telegram. The German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a telegram to a German agent in Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram suggested that if Mexico were to join Germany in an alliance and attack the United States, they would get Texas and Arizona in return. British intelligence gave the intercepted message to the Americans, and it was duly published in all major newspapers. It was the final straw, and American President Woodrow Wilson had no choice but to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. On the 28th of May, the first units of the American Expeditionary Force left New York, bound for France. Their commander was General John Black Jack Pershing. Unfortunately for the Allies, the Americans only had a small and poorly equipped army of just over 100,000 men. Its best units were the Marine Corps. It was to take over a year before the American forces were able to get to Europe, train and be ready to fight. Pershing was determined to keep his forces under American control and not see them used as reinforcements to make up British and French losses. The most important thing about America's involvement was that some 4 million troops were to be raised. In addition, the powerful economy and industry of the United States was now part of the Allied war effort. But it was by no means certain that the Allies could hold out. In February, the Germans had begun to withdraw to a new defense system called the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was a vast system of defences in northern France, constructed by the Germans during the winter of 1916-17. It ran from the area around Arras all the way to beyond Saint-Quentin and consisted of deep and wide trenches, thick belts of barbed wire, concrete machine gun positions, concrete bunkers, tunnels and command posts. It was considered virtually impregnable by the Germans, although the British offensives of 1917-1918 were to prove otherwise. As the Germans withdrew, they laid waste to towns, villages and countryside, so that all the Allies would inherit was a wasteland. It was a cruel policy that tore families apart, as able-bodied men and women were deported to Germany as slave workers. Robert Nivelle succeeded Joffre as Commander-in-Chief of the French Army in December 1916. He believed in aggressive tactics and introduced the innovative use of a creeping barrage of artillery fire. The idea was that artillery would aim its fire to land just in front of the infantry as they advanced. It was a technique that required practice and good lines of communication. Unfortunately, it was usually the telephone lines that usually got cut first in any enemy attack, and so there were incidents of artillery fire falling on their own troops. The main battle of the Nivelle offensive was fought on the Aisne from the 16th of April. It was an unmitigated disaster for the French army, a hugely costly attack, ultimately involving 1.2 million troops and 7,000 guns. It achieved little in the way of territorial gain, certainly not to the 48-hour breakthrough envisaged. Divisions of the French 5th and 6th armies went into battle along an 80-kilometre front from Soissons to Rheims after a week of diversionary attacks by the British in Arras. Opposite, the Germans occupied high ground that was heavily defended and fortified. On the 16th of April, the French suffered 40,000 casualties alone, a similar disaster to that suffered by the British on the first day of the Somme a year before. The mass use of French-built light tanks brought little advantage, with 150 lost on the first day. Ironically, in the attacks of the 16th and 17th of April, Nivelle's own innovation, the creeping barrage, was incorrectly deployed, leading to increased French casualties as the infantry advanced without protection. Despite suffering huge losses, French attacks continued until the 20th of April. Some gains were made, but progress was slow. The offensive was scaled back over the next 2 weeks, although by the 5th of May, a 4-kilometre stretch of the Chemin des Dames ridge, part of the Hindenburg Line, had been captured. The offensive was finally abandoned in disarray on the 9th of May following a final ineffective 4-day assault. French losses were significant, with 187,000 casualties. The Germans suffered an estimated 168,000 losses. But the French soldiers had had enough. Discontent had spread throughout the army, and some 30,000 men decided to leave their trenches and walk home. Many men had not been home in the 3 years since the war had begun. Officers were allowed to go home on a regular basis, but lowly privates were not given these privileges. Even British soldiers got home more often than French troops, even though they were fighting in their own country. In addition to the men who left the trenches, some 54 divisions, about half of the French army, refused to obey orders from their commanding generals. Discipline in the army collapsed and panic spread in the French high command and government. If the army quit fighting, then the war would be lost, and all the sacrifices made would be for nothing. Reaction was quick on the part of the high command. Several older generals were quickly replaced and a new overall commander was selected. General Pétain, who had fought several successful battles, was chosen to lead the army. He immediately took charge of the situation. Mass arrests were made of all the leaders of the mutiny. Officers and NCOs had to select men from their own units for trial. 24,000 men were tried and found guilty. 400 were sentenced to death, but only 50 were shot. The rest had their sentences commuted. Pétain also implemented a number of improvements for the men in the army. Better food, home leaves and periods of rest were put into effect. After 6 weeks of mutiny, the French army had been restored. Yet a powerful change had come over the army. It became clear that the French army would fight to defend their country, but would not go over to attack. This meant that the British and Commonwealth troops would now do the bulk of the fighting on the Western Front. The fighting spirit of the British and Commonwealth soldiers was to be severely tested during 1917. At Vimy Ridge, the Canadians showed that they had overcome their terrible experience at Ypres the year before by taking this important objective. Some 12 kilometers northeast of Arras, Vimy Ridge gained early importance during the war on account of the heights which overlooked the Allied-held town. German forces seized control of the ridge in September 1914 and promptly constructed deep defensive positions comprising of bunkers, caves, passages and artillery-proof trenches, heavily protected by concrete machine gun emplacements. With such formidable defenses in place, the German army rapidly set about the steady destruction of Arras, pounding the town with heavy artillery, apparently with impunity. French attempts to grab control of the bridge throughout 1915 were bloodily repulsed, with the loss of some 150,000 French casualties. Although the British relieved French operations in March 1916, they were pushed back along a 2-kilometer front before they could commence planning their recapture. As part of this offensive, the Canadian Corps, operating under British General Julian Byng, were tasked with the recapture of Vimy Ridge. In preparation for this, the Canadians constructed miles of tunnels through which troops could pass in readiness for the opening of the attack without coming under shell fire. Aerial reconnaissance, using observation balloons, ensured accurate news of German movements. At dawn on the morning of the 9th of April, Easter Monday 1917, the Canadian attack comprising 4 divisions began, following a heavy 3-week British artillery barrage and was supported by a well-devised creeping barrage. Within 30 minutes, the Canadian 1st Division under Arthur Currie had succeeded in capturing German frontline positions in spite of a snowstorm. Within a further half an hour, the second line had similarly passed into Canadian hands. With the entire ridge wholly under Allied control, by the 12th of April, the operation was judged a spectacular success, the single most successful Allied advance on the Western Front to that date. The ridge remained in Allied hands for the remainder of the war. But it did not come without cost. 10,602 Canadians were wounded during the attack, and over 3,500 killed. The opposing German force suffered even more heavily, with 20,000 casualties. The Allies' successes continued further north. The Battle of Messines was the most successful local operation of the war, certainly of the Western Front. Carried out by General Herbert Plummer's Second Army, it was launched on the 7th of June 1917 with the detonation of 19 underground mines underneath German lines. The target of the offensive was the Messines Ridge, a natural stronghold southeast of Ypres and a small German salient since late 1914. The attack was also a precursor to the much larger Third Battle of Ypres, often known as Passchendaele. General Plummer had begun plans to take the Messines Ridge in early 1916. Plummer preferred to plan for limited successes rather than gamble all on significant breakthrough. In preparing for the Messines battle, he had authorized the laying of 22 mine shafts underneath German lines all along the ridge. He planned to detonate all 22 at 0 hour at 3:10 on the 7th of June. Whilst the Germans were still dazed, the explosions were to be followed by infantry attacks, supported by artillery bombardments, tanks and gas. Work on laying the mines began some 18 months before. In the face of active German counter-mining, 8,000 meters of tunnel were constructed under German lines. Occasionally the tunnelers would encounter German counterparts engaged in the same task. Underground hand-to-hand fighting would ensue. Heavy preliminary artillery bombardment of the German lines began on the 21st of May. 2,300 guns and 300 heavy mortars were available for the opening barrage. At 2:50 on the morning of the 7th of June, the firing stopped. The German troops, sensing imminent attack, rushed to their defensive positions, machine guns ready, meanwhile sending up flares to detect British movement towards the ridge. Silence prevailed for the following 20 minutes until, at 3:10, the order was given across the line to detonate the mines, which totaled 600 tons of explosive. Of the 21 mines laid, 19 were exploded. The invariable loss of surprise by the use of preliminary bombardment was entirely offset by the effect of the mines, which blew the crest off the Messines Ridge. The explosion was audible in Dublin and by Lloyd George in his Downing Street study. The effect of the mine explosions upon the German defenders was devastating. Some 10,000 men were killed during the explosion alone. In its wake, 9 divisions of infantry advanced under protection of a creeping artillery barrage, tanks and gas attacks. All initial objectives were taken within 3 hours. Reserves from General Gough's Fifth Army and the French First Army reached their own final objectives by mid-afternoon. German troops counterattacked on the 8th of June without success. In fact, they lost further ground as the attacks were repelled. German counterattacks continued in diminishing form until the 14th of June. By this stage, the entire Messines salient was in Allied hands. The Messines battle, which greatly boosted morale among the Allies, signified the first time on the Western Front that defensive casualties actually exceeded attacking losses, 25,000 against 17,000. Whereas the first and second battles of Ypres were launched by the Germans in 1914 and 1915 respectively, Third Ypres was intended as Sir Douglas Haig's Allied forces' breakthrough in Flanders in 1917. Haig had long mulled the idea of launching a major offensive in Flanders. It was his preferred choice for 1916, although in the event the Battle of the Somme took precedence that summer. Meticulously planned, Third Ypres was launched on the 31st July 1917 and continued until the fall of Passchendaele village on the 6th of November. The offensive resulted in gains for the Allies, but was by no means the breakthrough Haig intended. And such gains as were made came at great cost in human terms. Today commonly referred to simply as Passchendaele, the tactics employed at the Third Battle of Ypres are as controversial as those executed at the Battle of the Somme a little over a year earlier, and was the final great battle of attrition of the war. The ostensible aim of the campaign was to be the destruction of German submarine bases on the Belgian coast. British Admiral Lord Jellicoe had issued a warning that the current level of shipping losses would prevent the British from sustaining the war into 1918, thus requiring clearance of the bases on the Belgian coast. Haig, whilst recognizing the urgency of this requirement, was at least as interested in finally breaking the will of the German army, which he believed was near to collapse. A view that he had similarly held at the height of the Somme offensive a year earlier. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was opposed to the Passchendaele offensive, and later came out highly critical of Haig's strategy and tactics in his published memoirs. But in the absence of a credible alternative, he felt obliged to sanction Haig's plans. He was, however, encouraged by the greatest local success of the war earlier that summer, the capture of the Messines Ridge under General Plummer. The capture of the ridge was a necessary precursor to an offensive aimed at capturing Passchendaele Ridge. With the instability of Russian forces in the field and the possibility of a Russian withdrawal from the war, the Allies were acutely aware such an action would enable Germany to draft its eastern forces into battle on the Western Front, dramatically increasing their reserve strength. The Third Battle of Ypres was opened by Sir Hubert Gough's Fifth Army, with one corps of Sir Herbert Plumer's Second Army joining on its right, and a corps of the French First Army, a total of 12 divisions. On the 18th of July, as was the norm for any major Allied offensive, a heavy preliminary artillery bombardment lasted for the 10 days. This was followed by the infantry attack at 0350 on the 31st of July. 3,000 guns which fired 4.25 million shells. Given such an onslaught, the German Fourth Army fully expected an imminent offensive. The element of surprise was entirely lost. Thus, when the attack was launched across an 18-kilometre front, the Fourth Army was in place to hold off the main British advance around the Menin Road. This restricted the Allies to fairly small gains to the left of the line around Pilkem Ridge. Similarly, the French were halted further north by the German Fifth Army. British attempts to renew the offensive over the course of the next few days were severely hampered by the onset of heavy rains, the heaviest in 30 years, which churned the Flanders lowland soil into a thick, muddy swamp. Tanks found themselves immobile, stuck fast in the mud. Similarly, the infantry found their mobility severely limited. Ironically, the very force of the preliminary bombardment had itself destroyed drainage systems, exacerbating the problem. In addition, the artillery shells that had rained down in the days prior to the attack's launch had further churned up the very ground that needed to be traversed by the advancing Allied force. As a consequence, no renewed major offensive could be contemplated until the 16th of August, when the Battle of Langemarck saw 4 days of fierce fighting, which resulted in small gains for the British, but with heavy casualties. Dissatisfied with progress, the British Commander-in-Chief, Haig, replaced Sir Hubert Gough by moving him and his forces further north with Herbert Plumer. Whereas Gough favoured sweeping aggression, Plumer planned a series of small gains rather than seeking an all-out breakthrough. The attacks began afresh on the 20th of September with the Battle of the Menin Road Bridge. This was followed by the Battle of Polygon Wood on the 26th of September and the Battle of Bruenstein on the 4th of October. Taken together, these established British possession of the ridge east of Ypres. Encouraged by Plumer's small gains, while constantly pushing him to do more, Haig decided to continue the offensive towards Passchendaele Ridge, some 10 kilometers from Ypres, by now certain that the German army was approaching collapse. Little progress towards this end was made at the Battle of Polycapelle and the First Battle of Passchendaele on the 9th of October and 12th of October, respectively. The Allied attackers were themselves nearing exhaustion as German reserves released from the Eastern Front were pouring onto the ridge. To aid their defense, the Germans made use of mustard gas, which caused chemical burns. Unwilling to concede the failure of the breakthrough, Haig pressed on with a further 3 assaults on the ridge in late October. The eventual capture of Passchendaele village by British and Canadian forces on the 6th of November finally gave Haig an excuse to call off the offensive, claiming success. The Third Battle of Ypres was, like its predecessors, a costly exercise. The British Expeditionary Force incurred some 310,000 casualties, with a similar, lower number of German casualties, 260,000. The salient had been widened by several kilometers. Further south in France, the Allies were to experience a major success with a new type of warfare using tanks. The Battle of Cambrai, launched in November 1917, heralded the first time tanks were used in significant force, a little over a year after they had made their tentative debut at Flers on the Somme. By the autumn of 1917, the popular reputation of tank effectiveness had suffered. Aside from their undoubted value as a surprise weapon, they were deemed to be of limited use as they were unwieldy and prone to breakdowns. Indeed, the German High Command, having overcome their initial alarm at the sudden appearance of the huge mechanical beasts, came to regard the tank with disdain, a device readily destroyed by use of concentrated field artillery. Given such an attitude, it was hardly surprising that German tank development came relatively late in the war. Nevertheless, the British Tank Corps remained convinced that if used on firmer ground, the weapon would prove itself. Thus, Lieutenant Colonel John Fuller of the Tank Corps recommended wide-scale use of tanks upon the dry battlefields sited between the Canal du Nord and the Saint-Quentin Canal. Fuller's proposal was promptly taken up by the Third Army commander, Julian Byng, the commander on the ground, but was vetoed by the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, who preferred to continue with operations at Passchendaele. In time, however, Haig, disappointed at the lack of progress at Passchendaele, turned back to Fuller and Byng's scheme, attracted by the notion of achieving a useful victory using the new weapon before the year was out. The attack was launched at dawn on the morning of the 20th of November, with all available tanks advancing across a 10-kilometer front. 476 tanks were accompanied by 6 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions, who were to exploit any breakthrough, plus a further 1,000 guns. Fourteen newly formed squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps stood by, a forerunner of the blitzkrieg tactics employed to great effect by the German army during the Second World War. And usually there was no preliminary bombardment, which helped ensure that the attack was a complete surprise. The lightly defended Germans were forced back some 6 kilometers to Cambrai, the 3 trench systems of the Hindenburg Line pierced for the first time in the war. Approximately 8,000 prisoners and 100 guns were captured on the first day alone. Much encouraged and greatly surprised by the notable gains of the first day, Haig determined to press on with the attack. But once the initial surprise had passed, British gains proved much harder to come by. Unfortunately, a lack of support to follow up the surprise breakthrough of the first day resulted in a critical loss of momentum. Despite their initial surprise, the Germans began pressing home wave after wave of counterattacks. Some 20 divisions were deployed during the German counterattack. Within a week, virtually all ground lost had been reclaimed. During the battle, casualties were high. The Germans suffered losses of approximately 50,000 and the British 45,000. If ultimately the mass deployment of tanks had failed to achieve the desired breakthrough, it had nevertheless demonstrated the tank's potential in offensive operations. In Britain, news of the initial spectacular breakthrough was greeted with celebrations and the ringing of church bells for the first time during the war. However, the war was not going well on the Italian front. The stalemate along the Isonzo River that had survived 11 battles was about to be broken. The Battle of Caporetto, which is also referred to as the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, saw combined Austro-Hungarian and German forces decisively break through the Italian line along the northern Isonzo. The Italian defenders were caught entirely by surprise. The scale of the Italian defeat at Caporetto led to both a change in government and Luigi Cardonia's dismissal as chief of staff. Caporetto marked the first occasion on which the Germans provided assistance to their Austro-Hungarian allies on the Italian front. Although Cardonia's policy of launching successive breakthrough attacks along the Isonzo was proving highly costly in terms of Italian casualties, it was nevertheless succeeding in dangerously weakening Austro-Hungarian resources. 9 Austrian divisions were supplemented by 6 German divisions, although the Italians retained over numerical supremacy along the Isonzo front by some 41 divisions to 35. They were notably weaker at the point selected by the German army for a combined offensive. Launched at 2 a.m. on the 24th of October from a salient at Tolmino, and much aided by prevalent misty conditions, the Austro-Hungarian-German attack took the Italians by complete surprise. The scale of the Italian setback, some 300,000 casualties had been incurred, 90% of which were as prisoners. Virtually all artillery was lost. The defeat produced sizable shockwaves among the Allied governments. Until Caporetto, the Italians had been left to fight the Austro-Hungarian army alone on the Italian front. With the advent of German support and the disaster at Caporetto, however, this policy was revoked, with substantial Allied aid promised henceforth. 6 French army divisions were supplemented by 5 British divisions, both boosted by large air contingents. By the end of 1917, both sides were to some extent locked in a race against time. Britain was in danger of being starved into submission by the U-boats. But the American Expeditionary Force was now in France, scheduled to reach up to 3 million men in size. The Germans also realized that decisive action was needed before the Americans were ready to join the fight. 1918 would be a decisive year for both sides. 1918 was the last year of the war. Both sides were exhausted by the conflict. In Britain, France and Germany, there was a looming shortage of manpower, caused by enormous casualties, forcing a wider conscription. All sides had reached a point that new drafts were not going to be enough to replace the losses. For the Allies, this problem was mitigated by the fact that the United States had entered the war the year before. Some 3 million men were due to join the British and French on the Western Front. In August 1914, Britain was the sole major European power not to have conscription. Although there was a tremendous wave of patriotic fervour to join up, compulsory military service remained an anathema to British politicians and public alike. But despite the public enthusiasm for volunteers, the numbers that came forward were insufficient to make up the losses on various British battlefronts around the world. But it wasn't until January 1916 that the British government introduced the first in a series of military service acts which set out call-up regulations. The Act of January 1916 specified that men from the ages of 18 to 41 were liable to be called up for service unless they were married or widowed with children, or else served in one of a number of reserved professions. Within 4 months, a revised version of the Act was passed. This enabled the War Office in London to extend the service of time-expired servicemen and call up all men, regardless of marital status, from the ages of 18 to 41. The government also gained the right to re-examine men previously declared medically unfit for service. The Act was revised again in January 1918, as the demand for human war material was insatiable. This enabled the government to quash all exemptions from military service on occupational grounds at its own discretion. And where exemptions from service had been withdrawn, the standard 2-month grace period was abolished. Three months later, in April 1918, at the height of the Great German Spring Offensive on the Western Front, a 5th version of the Act was published. Its most notable provision extended age eligibility so that men aged from 17 to 51 could be called up. In addition, the Act was, for the first time, to be applied to men in Ireland, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. 1914 and the introduction of the first Military Service Act, as many as 3 million men volunteered for military service. From January 1916 until the close of the war, a further 2.3 million men were formally conscripted into service. As the factories were emptied of men, so women took their place at the machines. Millions of women saw it as their chance to contribute to the war effort. Women found employment in transport, on the rail lines and driving buses and trams. Nursing, factories making ammunition, the Women's Royal Air Force, where they worked on planes as mechanics, on farms in the Women's Land Army, in shipyards and so on. Before 1914, these jobs, with the exception of nursing, had been for men only. It is hardly surprising then that women were reluctant to return to domestic routine at the end of the war. They felt that they had earned the right to play an equal role in rebuilding the world after the war. For men returning from the trenches, it was another reminder of how much the world had changed while they were away, and many found it hard to accept. Germany had also eased its manpower problems following Russia's revolution and collapse. By early March, the Russians had agreed an armistice with the Germans, but at huge cost in terms of territory and material supplies. Following the Russians' collapse, the Germans were able to transfer the armies in the east to France. With 500,000 troops added to Germany's strength from the Russian front, Ludendorff was confident of success. But German High Command under Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff were acutely aware that time was not on their side, following the arrival of the American forces. Realistically, a decisive German victory was unlikely, but if they were to mount a series of offensives in quick succession, then they might be able to negotiate more favorable terms. The Germans had also been developing their tactics. Instead of sending massed ranks of men along a broad front, they began developing special units of storm troops. These soldiers travelled lightly and were skilled in fast, hard-hitting attacks before moving on to the next target. Unlike soldiers burdened with weighty kit, the stormtroopers carried little except weaponry, such as flamethrowers, which could cause much panic. Their role was to punch through sections of the line and keep going to attack the reserves. Other forces would then feed through to attack the defenders from behind. By the spring of 1918, the Allies knew that there would be a major German attack. They just did not know where it would come. The British reinforced their positions near the coast, while the French strengthened their positions to the south of the British. However, this left a weakness in the British line to the west of Cambrai. Here the British trench system had not been completed, and those that had been dug were inadequate. Sir Hubert Gough, who commanded the Fifth Army in this area, was well aware of this predicament, and more conscious of the fact that he had few reserves to call on if the Germans did attack the sector where the Fifth Army was stationed. German reconnaissance had made them aware that the area was less well defended. The Germans' aim was to drive a wedge between the British and French, making it difficult for them to make a coordinated counterattack. Their main objective was to take Ames, which was a major rail junction for the rail network in western France. On March 31st, 1918, Ludendorff launched the offensive. In just 5 hours, the Germans fired 1 million artillery shells at the British lines held by the Fifth Army. Over 3,000 shells fired every minute. The artillery bombardment was followed by an attack by elite stormtroopers. By the end of the first day of the attack, 21,000 British soldiers had been taken prisoner, and the Germans had made great advances through the lines of the Fifth Army. Senior British commanders lost control of the situation. They had spent 3 years used to static warfare, and suddenly they had to cope with a German onslaught. Gough ordered the Fifth Army to withdraw. The German attack was the biggest breakthrough in 3 years of warfare on the Western Front. Ironically, the British gave up to the Germans the Somme region, where so many British and German soldiers had been killed in the Battle of 1916. For the first time since trench warfare had begun in 1914, the British Army had been defeated. But there was more to come. Within 5 days, the Germans had recaptured all the terrain around the Somme, lost in the previous 2 years, ground that had been fought over at such high cost. Within 10 days, they were at the gates of their main objective, Ames. But hastily thrown defences, using reserves and French troops, rushed up from the south, gradually slowed the German advance. In April, the Germans struck again, this time to the north of the River Lys. Once again, they made spectacular progress, smashing their way through a Portuguese division. In the rear lines, they found tired British divisions, recovering from the mauling they had endured in March. The British Expeditionary Force had known hard times before, but this was different, and Haig issued a personal message to the troops, the only time he did so during the entire war. In it, he made clear that their backs were to the wall, and thus they should be prepared to fight to the end. With French help, the Germans were halted. British losses had been substantial, and these could only be made up with newly conscripted 18-year-olds. Ludendorff knew he had to keep the Allies on the wrong foot, and so he then switched his attention to attacking in the south. His aim was to draw Allied forces south so that he could resume the attack in the north. The attack was launched early on the 27th of May with a ferocious heavy artillery bombardment of 4,000 guns. Over 2 million shells had been stockpiled for the bombardment across a 40-kilometer front. Owing to the heavy concentration of primarily British troops in the front-line trenches, casualties from the bombardment were severe. The bombardment was accompanied by a gas attack designed to disable defensive gun crews, after which 17 divisions of German infantry under Crown Prince Wilhelm began their advance through a 40-kilometer gap in the Allied line. With the Allied forces entirely taken by surprise, the rapid progress of the German troops was reminiscent of the more fluid war of movement of the opening months of the war. Between Soissons and Rheims, the Germans broke through a further 8 Allied divisions, 4 British, 4 French, reaching the Aisne in under 6 hours. By the end of the first day, the Germans had gained 15 kilometers of territory and had reached the River Vesle. By the 30th of May, the Germans had managed to capture 50,000 Allied soldiers and 800 guns, arriving within 90 kilometers of Paris by the 3rd of June. They also began to bombard Paris itself, using a huge railway-mounted gun called Big Bertha. Big Bertha was the largest artillery piece in the world, capable of dropping an 820-kilogram shell from 75 miles away. She was one of 4 large guns that played a central role in destroying the Belgian forts in the first weeks of 1914. Although she was a fearsome weapon, her actual impact was more psychological than physical. But just as it seemed as if the Allies were defeated, the offensive began running out of steam. At the front, the German troops, underfed with poor quality food, could not believe their eyes as they stormed into Allied-held villages and towns. Control and discipline broke down as soldiers set about looting the shops for any luxuries that could be carried away. Also, the conditions in the trenches, coupled with a poor diet, meant that the soldiers were prone to infections. In June 1918, some 500,000 German troops were struck down by the first wave of Spanish influenza, which would go on to claim some 50 million lives worldwide immediately after the war. Another problem was that the further the Germans advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became. Finally, the British blockade of German ports was now biting hard, and Germany had simply run out of the raw materials it needed to make weapons and ammunition. The failure of the Michael offensive meant that Germany had now little chance of winning the war. The Allies, meanwhile, had put all their forces under the single command of General Foch. Tanks, aircraft, artillery and infantry were integrated into coordinated plans with achievable objectives, something the Germans never fully mastered. Elsewhere, the war was beginning to contract. The Austro-Hungarians were on the point of bankruptcy and starvation. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire had been defeated. And at home, many Germans were tired of the war. All they wanted was food and democracy. but the Allies were still going to have to force the Germans out of France. In what began as the last major German offensive of the First World War, the Second Battle of the Marne developed into a significant Allied victory. After it became clear that the Germans had not only failed in their aim to win the war in this offensive, but had in fact lost ground, a number of German commanders, including Crown Prince Wilhelm, believed the war was lost. On the day of the offensive's launch, on the 15th of July, 23 German divisions of the 1st and 3rd Armies attacked the French 4th Army to the east of Rheims, while a further 17 divisions of the 7th Army and the new 9th Army attacked the French 6th Army in the west. In attacking Rheims in this way, Ludendorff aimed to split the French forces. Joining the French were 85,000 US forces, plus troops from Sir Douglas Haig's British Expeditionary Force, although the majority of the latter's forces were located further north in Flanders. The attack to the east quickly proved a failure and was halted at 11 a.m. on the first day without being resumed. However, the offensive to the west of Rheims was more successful, breaking through the French 6th Army and crossing the Marne. The Germans established a bridgehead 9 miles in length and 4 in depth before the French 9th Army, supported by British, American and Italian troops, halted its advance on the 17th of July. With the Germans having ultimately failed in their efforts to break through, Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, authorized a counter-offensive. On the 18th of July, 24 divisions of the French Army, in addition to US, British and Italian troops, and some 350 tanks, launched their counter-offensive. Foch's aim was to eliminate the large German salient. In this he was entirely successful. The French 10th Army and 6th Army led the attack, advancing 5 miles on the first day alone. Meanwhile, the French 5th Army and 9th Army launched subsidiary attacks in the west. On the 20th of July, the Germans ordered a retreat. By the 3rd of August, they were back where they had started, the launch of the Great Spring Offensive, at the Aisne-Vesle rivers. The Allied counter-offensive was finally halted on the 6th of August by the now solidly entrenched Germans. As a consequence of the disastrous result in Marne, Ludendorff's planned Flanders offensive was initially postponed, then entirely cancelled. No further large-scale attempt to win the war was undertaken. The American First Army was now beginning to make its presence felt. Its first offensive had been launched at Cantigny on the 28th of May. Troops of the US 1st Division advanced, supported by French tanks and heavy artillery. In the face of 7 severe counterattacks that day and the next, the US forces held their position with the loss of 1,067 casualties. They captured around 100 German prisoners. The American success at Cantonade was followed by attacks at Château-Thierry and Belle-Île Wood in the first half of June. The failure of the spring offensive meant that the Germans were now on the defensive. At the beginning of August, the Allies began a series of offensives aimed at keeping the Germans off balance. As soon as they began stabilizing in one sector, another offensive would be launched in another. The Americans were to play a significant role in this final phase of the war. On the 8th of August, the British Fourth Army launched an attack on the Ames front, preceded by over 300 heavy tanks. Armour, artillery, aircraft and infantry fought as one with dramatic results. By the end of the month, they faced the mighty defences of the Hindenburg Line. Until now, American units have been lent piecemeal to the Allies, much against Pershing's wish to have US soldiers fighting under American command. At the beginning of September, he got his way, and the 1st American Army came into being. It was deployed to the south of Verdun at Saint-Michel. The concentration of troops for a major offensive began at once. The Saint-Michel salient, which had been formed in the fall of 1914, seriously hampered French rail communications between Paris and the eastern segments of the front. Pershing assembled 300,000 troops for what was to be America's first offensive in the war. But the German High Command, aware the attack was coming, ordered a partial withdrawal of troops. The withdrawal was still in progress when the US Army attacked on the 12th of September. A secondary assault by 110,000 French troops took place 3 hours later. 1,400 aircraft under the command of General William Billy Mitchell supported the advancing US and French troops. This was to be the largest air assault of the war. On the first day, the main attack advanced 9 kilometers to reach Fainecourt, and the French troops captured the village of Dommatin. By the 16th of September, the entire Saint-Mihiel salient was under Allied control. German morale was at an all-time low. The realization that German resources could not hope to match the might of American industry, now firmly on a war footing, made the war pointless and undermined the resolution of the ordinary soldier. It was in this gloomy mood that the Germans retired behind the Hindenburg Line at the beginning of September. That it followed the line of the German gains from 1914 only served to emphasize the pointlessness of the war. Since the start of the spring offensive, Germany had lost 1 million men, losses it could not hope to replace. Following the success at Ames, the Allies continued to launch their offensives up and down the Western Front. Finally, on September the 26th, the BEF smashed through the Hindenburg Line. Two days later, the Allies had crossed the Saint-Quentin Canal, which formed a seemingly impregnable part of the German defenses. Fighting was in progress all the way from the North Sea to Switzerland. It was naturally more intense wherever the Allies applied the greatest pressure. As the British were attacking the Hindenburg Line, French and American forces launched the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Using several ruses to deceive the Germans into thinking the offensive would head towards Metz in the north, the US First Army began to form in the area around the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. At 5:30 in the afternoon of September the 26th, the American First Army jumped off with the French holding their flanks. Following a rolling barrage of artillery fire, the US First Army crashed through the German defenses. The US Third Corps pushed its way into the German second defensive line, although the Fifth Corps was stopped at Montfaucon during the first day. To add to the pressure on the Germans, Italy launched a major offensive at Vittorio Veneto, which would end in defeat for the Austro-Hungarian forces and the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. The combined Italian force totaled a sizable 57 divisions, of which 3 were British and 2 were French, along with a single US regiment. Ranged against them were 52 nominal Austro-Hungarian divisions. In terms of artillery, the Italians also held the advantage, with 7,700 guns to 6,030. Crucially, Italian morale was notably higher than the thoroughly demoralized Austro-Hungarian force. The attack opened on the 23rd of October 1918, with an Italian advance in the mountains. The extent of Austro-Hungarian resistance surprised Diaz and succeeded in preventing any significant Italian gains, although the Austro-Hungarians were obliged to bring up reserves from the lower Piave. Such reserves could be ill afforded given that the main Italian advance began the same day in the lower Piave. With the Allies succeeding in advancing 24 kilometers along a 56-kilometer front, a truce was finally agreed on the 2nd of November with the capture of Tagliamento. An armistice came into effect the following day, signed at Padua. Hostilities were formally concluded on the 4th of November 1918. A resounding success for the Allies, the Battle of Vittorio Veneto finished the Austro-Hungarian army as a fighting force. The Italians lost some 38,000 casualties, a figure dwarfed by the 300,000 prisoners suffered by the Austro-Hungarians. With Germany's allies Bulgaria and Turkey also seeking an armistice, it was only a matter of time before Germany would also have to give up the struggle, especially as France and American forces were now threatening to advance into Germany itself. To add to the pressure was an escalating atmosphere of unrest among the civilian population, worn down by years of deprivation. So that the German fleet's port of Kiel mutinied on November the 3rd. They had heard rumours of a plan to sail for one last time and confront the Royal Navy in open seas. It would have been a suicide mission, and the sailors would have none of it. Soon the mutiny began to spread and riots broke out in numerous German cities. Revolution now swept through the streets. Ludendorff had resigned, and approaches had been made to the United States seeking an armistice. Initiating the armistice negotiations on the 4th of October 1918, the Germans directed peace feelers towards the US government led by President Wilson. Wilson was naturally willing to conclude a peace based upon his doctrine for future peace and stability. However, his allies raised immediate objections. Britain, led by Lloyd George, opposed a ban on the policy of blockades. France was intent on imposing swingeing reparations upon the beaten foe. Wilson compromised by accepting both objections, whilst threatening to negotiate a separate peace on behalf of the US if Britain and France continued with their objections. His ploy successful, details of a proposed settlement were sent to Germany on the 5th of November by the Supreme War Council. A major potential stumbling block to peace was Wilson's insistence upon the abdication of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. This was overcome by German Chancellor Max von Baden's exacerbated decision to announce a reluctant Wilhelm's abdication to the public on the 9th of November 1918. On the 8th of November, a German delegation met with Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch, who was to lead the military negotiations in the forest of Compiègne, some 65 kilometers northeast of Paris. The armistice was signed at 5 a.m. on the morning of 11th November 1918 and came into effect 6 hours later at 11 a.m., forever remembered as the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. armistice initially ran for 30 days, but was regularly renewed until the formal peace treaty was signed at Versailles the following year. Should the Germans have deviated in any way from the terms of the armistice, the Allies warned that a resumption of hostilities would begin within 48 hours. The terms of the armistice required the Germans to evacuate German-occupied territories on the Western Front within 2 weeks. Allied forces were to occupy the left bank of the Rhine within a month, and a neutral zone established on the right bank. Notably, all German-occupied territories elsewhere were to be abandoned, and the treaties already negotiated with Russia and Romania were officially annulled. In terms of military equipment, under the terms of the armistice, the Germans lost 5,000 artillery pieces, 30,000 machine guns, 2,000 aircraft, 5,000 locomotives, 150,000 railway wagons, 5,000 trucks, and its entire submarine fleet. The majority of Germany's surface naval fleet was interned, the remainder being disbanded. In June 1919, the German Navy scuttled its ships in the British anchorage at Scapa Flow. The terms of the armistice were inevitably seen as punitive within Germany. The country, however, was in no condition to resume hostilities, and so reluctantly accepted the conditions. The French nevertheless viewed the terms of the armistice and the Versailles peace treaty that followed in 1919 as overly lenient, indicating the widely contrasting views of both the armistice and the subsequent treaty. The catastrophic war was at an end. Whilst there was joy when the armistice began, it was more out of relief than exhilaration that the exhausted troops celebrated the coming of peace. Little had been gained but much lost in the 4 years of war. The once great empires of Russia, the Habsburgs, the Ottomans and Germany were broken up. The British Empire, having borrowed huge amounts of money in order to buy war materials and food, faced economic crisis. Areas of France where most of the battles had been fought have been reduced to virtual wastelands and would also require vast sums of cash to rebuild the shattered country. French negotiators looked to Germany to make good French losses. To determine the amount that Germany was to pay, the Allied Reparations Commission was established. They toured France, Belgium and parts of England to determine the damage done by the war. In April of 1921, the Commission announced the final bill that Germany was required to pay. The total was established at 132 billion gold German marks. The German government was to pay the debt off in installments of 2.5 billion gold mark per year. The final payment was to occur in 1961. Germany made its first payment in 1921, but by 1922 the economy of the country had collapsed and was facing hyperinflation. Although Britain agreed to a 3-year break, Belgium and France would not, and began seizing German factories in compensation. Some 16 million men had gone to war, of whom 10 million were killed. For those who returned, they found that many aspects of the world they had left behind had changed beyond recognition. For example, women only held minor jobs before the Great War. They could be maids or cooks, but were limited beyond these roles. As a result of the war, they took on most of the traditional jobs held by men. Women began delivering the mail and coal, driving buses, ploughing fields and making explosives. Many changes occurred for women that allowed them access to different jobs, better pay and more freedom within society. The men returning from the front lines after the war were shocked by many of these changes. But in the heart of Europe, there lay a shattered Germany, harboring a grievous sense of humiliation and injustice. There were many former soldiers who mistakenly believed they had not lost the war on the battlefield, but due to traitors at home. The combination of these sentiments, coupled with economic collapse, only fueled the turmoil. Ultimately, Germany's predicament created a fertile ground for extremists. It was a situation that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party were to exploit to such disastrous effect, plunging the world into another far more catastrophic world war in 1939.